Hello, fellow Sapiens, and a quiet welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're curled beneath a blanket at the edge of sleep, taking a deep breath after a long day, or simply filling the stillness with thought, this space is for you. Because tonight, we're stepping into the quiet turning point when humans stopped being hunters and began growing the world. This is calm storytelling for curious apes. It's the untold story of the birth of agriculture, a 12,000-year-old moment, wrapped in silence, seed, and forgetting. But it's not the simple tale of progress you might expect. It wasn't invention. It was entanglement. Oh, and if you're the kind of strange and thoughtful human who enjoys slow science and poetic prehistory, just look beneath this video. You'll see a button that says subscribe. Press it if you feel called. You can always unsubscribe later. And that small bell beside it, tap it to be gently notified when new stories arrive. Subscribing really does help this channel survive. Without it, these videos can't keep being made. If these stories bring you calm, you can tap the super thanks under this video. It truly helps keep these prehistoric journeys alive. By the way, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? If you feel like sharing, I'd love to know. It's a quiet reminder that we're all here, listening together. Also, it's okay to drift off. You'll find timestamps down below. Now, we begin with a final hunt beneath a fading Ice Age sky. 12,000 years ago, something changed in the human story. Not suddenly, not with fire or fanfare, but with silence. A silence that fell after the last great hunt. For hundreds of thousands of years, human beings had lived not by growing the world, but by moving through it, by tracking, by waiting, by listening to the breath of wind over ice and the subtle shift of hoofbeat through snow. But something happened near the end of the last Ice Age. Across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, the final embers of the mammoth hunts began to cool. And with them, so too began the fading of a way of life that had once defined what it meant to be human. What happens to a species when it stops running with the herds, when it stops chasing the heartbeat of the earth? What shifts inside us when the chase ends, and the hunt is no longer the rhythm of life? These questions echo backward across the millennia, suspended in the still air of a changing planet, where the last mammoth bones rest beneath layers of dust and time. In this moment, in this quiet, irreversible turning, we find the seed of our transformation. Life in the Upper Paleolithic was not chaos, not desperation, not a constant battle with the wild. It was intricate, ritualized, and in its own way, stable. The world of the late hunter-gatherers was rich in memory and meaning. Beneath skies streaked with aurora and starlight, families gathered around fire pits carved into the soil of temporary shelters, their walls painted with ochre and ash, their floors worn smooth by generations of feet. There was song, there was language, there was knowledge, passed from elder to child, from hand to hand, on how to knap a blade from obsidian, how to twist sinew into rope, how to read the tracks in thawing snow. They lived lightly, yes, but not carelessly. Each choice mattered. The distance between survival and starvation was often one mistake wide, but in that precariousness there was also clarity, a visceral awareness of place, of season, of prey. The mammoths, with their massive bodies and ancient eyes, were not simply beasts to be slain. They were companions in a dance older than memory. When a hunt succeeded, it was not just meat that was won. It was warmth, tools, thread, shelter, ceremony. The mammoth was a walking storehouse of life, a mobile cathedral of bone and sinew, and its loss would echo through the lives of those who had learned to depend on its migration as predictably as the tide. How do you build a life around something that can vanish? They knew the routes, the winding paths across tundra and steppe that the herds would follow. They knew the seasons, when the calves would be born, when the rivers would flood, when the ice would harden enough to cross. Their calendars were made not of paper, but of weather. Their clocks were the calls of birds, the shift of stars. And yet, even as they followed these rhythms with ancestral precision, the rhythm itself was beginning to falter. The ice, that ancient architect of the northern world west, was withdrawing. Not rapidly, not violently, but with a creeping slowness that rewrote the map of everything. Glaciers that had held the world in their frozen grasp for tens of thousands of years began to loosen their fingers, Valleys once carved by ice rivers now flowed with meltwater. Grasslands pushed into old permafrost, and forests began to inch forward into the open steppe. The mammoths, once so many, began to thin. Not because they were overhunted, not yet, but because the land that had once nourished them was vanishing beneath their feet. What do you do when the world that raised you begins to forget your name? For the people of the Upper Paleolithic, the changes were not abstract. They were felt in hunger, in confusion, in the slow realization that the old hunting grounds no longer yielded what they once had. The animals were still there, for a time, but they were fewer, scattered, shifting in behaviour. The great herds broke apart into smaller clusters. The predators that followed them, humans among them, were forced to adapt, to wander further, to gamble more with each passing season. And in that uncertainty, the seeds of something new began to grow, but not without loss. In places like what is now southern France, families retreated deeper into the earth, into limestone caves that held the memories of warmer ages. They painted on walls not just to record, but perhaps to remember, to preserve something sacred against the erosion of time. Horses with flared nostrils, aurochs with massive horns, mammoths drawn with curved lines and a careful hand, as if the very act of painting could hold the world in place. But the world was moving on. In the steppes of Siberia, in the valleys of Anatolia, and across the spreading grasslands of the Americas, similar patterns played out. The animals that had once been the anchors of human survival were receding, not all at once and not everywhere, but steadily, like the melting edge of a glacier retreating uphill. Some groups followed the animals as far as they could go, others turned to smaller game, to roots and seeds, to the overlooked corners of the edible world. The body of human knowledge stretched, strained, and changed. Can you remain who you are when everything that sustained you begins to vanish? This was not extinction. Not yet. But it was contraction. A slow drawing in of breath before the plunge into something unrecognizable. The world was still wide, still wild, but it no longer moved to the same pulse. The bond between human and beast, between hunter and hunted, was fraying. The great mammoth, once a continent-spanning companion, was becoming memory. And memory, for the Paleolithic mind, was not passive. It was a living thread, woven into story and song, danced out in ritual and whispered into the ears of children as they watched the embers fall. But stories could not feed a village. Reverence could not replace protein. As the climate shifted, so too did the calculations of survival. The bodies of hunter-gatherers, once built for bursts of endurance and strength, began to carry the strain of longer travels, leaner meals, and harsher winters, and yet they endured. In the frozen north, some hunted reindeer through narrowing corridors of ice and wind. In the warmer pockets of the south, red deer and wild boar took the place of woolly giants. But these animals were smaller, faster, harder to predict. They did not gather in herds 1,000 strong, nor did they linger in great open plains like their colder cousins. The human toolkit adapted. Spears gave way to more complex projectiles, traps and snares grew more sophisticated. Cooperative hunting strategies evolved in silence and gesture, but with every adaptation came a compromise. Larger game offered more than just meat. Their bones became beams, their hides, shelter, their sinews, thread. To lose such animals was to lose architecture, textiles, tools. It was to unravel the practical theology of life itself, that every part of the animal had meaning, use, and spirit. When the mammoth fell, it was not just a death. It was the closing of a chapter in the human relationship with the world. What remains when a cosmology collapses? Around the hearth, new stories took root. Tales not only of the chase, but of endurance, of finding food in strange places, of listening more closely to the land, to the pulse of tubers underground, to the migration of birds, to the quiet promise of grains left behind by the wind. Children who once learned to throw spears now learned to crack nuts and grind roots. Hands that once flensed thick mammoth hide began to crush acorns into paste. This was not farming, not yet, but it was noticing. It was the turning of the head toward possibility. In this space between what was and what might be, the world narrowed. For many groups, home became more defined, less nomadic, more seasonal. Campsites grew familiar. Storage pits appeared in the ground, lined with bark and stone, as people began to think not just of today's hunger, but of hunger in the months to come. To store was to believe in return. To cache was to declare a future. Can you still call yourself a hunter if you begin to wait in one place? There is no singular moment when humans stopped hunting. There was no final mammoth slain beneath a rising sun. It was instead a slow, collective pause, stretched across continents and generations, a quiet shift in rhythm, where the footsteps of the ancestors began to echo differently across the land. And the land, too, was changing in voice. Once the domain of endless wind-swept plains, the earth began to murmur with new sounds, the cracking of saplings breaking through permafrost, the drip of meltwater carving paths into old stone, the distant hum of insect life where once there had been only silence. The biosphere was reorganizing itself, no longer the glacial fortress it had been. It now began to bloom and fragment, forming patchworks of forest and meadow, swamp and dune. This was not a return to paradise. It was something stranger, something unfamiliar. For the hunter-gatherers, these changes posed riddles written in shadow. Tracks vanished more quickly in softer ground. Rivers changed their courses. Animals disappeared into thickets that had not existed a generation before. Where once a child could be taught the migratory path of a herd, now the world itself seemed to forget its own rules. Elders who had spoken with certainty now hesitated, watching the horizon with eyes no longer sure. And in that hesitation, an opening. Because uncertainty breeds both fear and innovation, and human beings, fragile and fire-hearted, have always been alchemists of adaptation. In a world where the hunt no longer guaranteed survival, curiosity began to matter more than courage. The eye that noticed a seed germinating beside the ashes of a fire, the hand that realized a plant might grow again where scraps had been thrown. These small acts, born not of planning but of observation, carried within them the architecture of a different future. But we are not there yet. Here, in the twilight of the Upper Paleolithic, we walk with those who still move to the pulse of the land. In places like Dolní Věstonice, in the cold reaches of what is now the Czech Republic, vast open-air camps show the traces of coordinated life. Bone structures arranged with geometric precision, hearths surrounded by discarded tools, figurines moulded from clay and fired in earth ovens. These are not the markings of desperation. They are the fingerprints of a mind attuned to symbol and meaning. What were they thinking, these people of mammoth bone and fire? Were they aware that the world was tilting? Did they feel it in their sleep, in the aching cold of winters that no longer arrived, or in the rains that came too soon? Did they sense that their mastery over landscape, learned with such patient repetition, was no longer quite enough? Across the globe, in the highlands of what is now Ethiopia, in the river valleys of the Levant, in the slow-moving wetlands of Southeast Asia, human communities responded in 1,000 different ways. Some retreated into ever deeper communion with nature. Others began reshaping it in subtle, persistent gestures. But beneath it all, something vital had shifted. The hunt was no longer the only story being told, and yet it lingered, not just in practice, but in identity. To hunt was not merely to obtain food. It was to enter into a covenant with movement, to live within the muscle memory of migration, to exist in a dialogue with wildness. It shaped everything: the body, the pace of speech, the silence between words. Even as the mammoths disappeared and the reindeer thinned, even as camps became more permanent and tools more varied, the spirit of the hunt remained etched into muscle and myth. But myths do not sustain forever. The climate continued its long, slow breath into warmth. Glaciers that had once towered like gods shrank back into mountain shadows. Lakes appeared where once there had been nothing but stone. And in these warmer hollows, new plants took root. Some of them followed humans as they moved. Others were carried, unknowingly, in fur and dung and ash. Still others grew where refuse was buried, germinating in the quiet promise of return. Here, around the dying embers of the last great hunts, a new kind of relationship began. Not based on pursuit, but on attention. What happens when a species that chased the world begins to wait for it? In the archaeological record, the traces are faint. A few more grinding stones here, a rise in charred seed remains there, fragments of huts that suggest longer stays, deeper ties, and still the bones remain. Thinner, more fragile but familiar. These were not different humans. These were not yet farmers. But they were on the cusp of a transformation so complete it would rewrite their descendants' bones, genes, languages, and gods. They did not know this. They could not. To them the shift was likely invisible, a simple choice to stay one season longer near a river that gave and gave, or to follow the deer only halfway, then stop. To plant nothing, but to notice. To tend nothing, but to remember. And so the world changed. Not with intention, but with pattern. And pattern, repeated long enough, becomes law. 12,000 years later, we look back and call it the Neolithic Revolution. We draw arrows across maps and pin it to dates. But beneath those diagrams is a quieter story. A story of absence, of farewell, of the long goodbye between human and mammoth, between footstep and wind, between motion and stillness. What is lost when you stop following the wild? The day humans stopped hunting was not a day. It was a slow and silent unfolding, a moment stretched across centuries, carried in the lull between famine and abundance, in the hesitation before returning to the chase, in the accidental planting of a seed. And in that seed, a future. But for now, in the hush of melting ice and the fading echo of mammoth trumpets, the last hunt is ending. The fire burns low, the tools are set down, and the earth waits quietly for what comes next. Before there were fields, before there were farmers, before the word agriculture was ever whispered beneath a sunlit sky, there was a pause in the chase, a hesitation in the footfall of the hunter, a quiet noticing. This is the story of that pause, the moment when humans, who for thousands of years had survived by pursuit, by movement, by the hunt, began to form a different kind of relationship with the land. Not a plan, not a revolution, but a flicker, a question, a whisper in the grain. What does it mean to realize something grows back? Scattered across the world in the slow thaw of the last ice age, human groups began to notice strange patterns taking shape around them. Where camps had once been pitched and fires burned low, small plants reappeared, sometimes in greater number, sometimes in surprising places. Certain animals, dogs, pigs, goats, began hovering at the edges of settlements, not just as threats or prey, but as something else. They followed, lingered, learned. Their presence shifted from incidental to intentional. The lines between the wild and the human began to blur, not through conquest, but through proximity. In the Near East, long before irrigation, before cities, before the word domestication ever passed through human lips, a people we now call the Natufians settled into a kind of stillness. Not absolute, they still moved with the seasons, but markedly more rooted than their ancestors. They returned to the same caves, the same ledges, the same river valleys. There, in the hills and ridges of the Levant, the seeds of wild barley and einkorn wheat began to trace circles around their lives. These were not yet crops, not in the way we understand them, but they were not untouched either. Is it possible to begin farming without knowing you are farming? The answer lies not in intention, but in interaction. The Natufians did not plant in rows, they did not plough, but they harvested, they gathered, they stored. And when the seeds spilled or were discarded into the soil, some of them grew. Season after season, the plants that thrived were those that stayed close, those whose seeds did not shatter easily, whose stalks were sturdier, whose timing aligned better with human rhythm. Without meaning to, these ancient people became co-authors of a biological script. The plants evolved not alone, but in conversation. Around the fire, children learned to identify which seeds were easiest to grind, which were gentler on the teeth, which resisted rot. In the cool corners of shelters, the first baskets began to store not just meat and hide, but grains. Grinding stones smoothed under generations of use, their wear not from urgency, but from repetition. This was not a leap. It was an accumulation of moments, of patterns, of understanding slowly passed from hand to hand. What changes when you stop chasing food and begin waiting for it to return? Perhaps it begins as trust, or perhaps it begins as accident. A dropped seed sprouting beside a sleeping mat, a patch of grain growing thicker each year near the midden heap, a goat lingering, not out of fear, but familiarity. In the quiet threshold between winter and spring, the idea forms not as a sentence, but as a feeling. The feeling that the world might be shaping itself around you, just as you shape yourself around it. In the Natufian world, this mutual shaping began to manifest in small, beautiful ways. Hearths became more permanent, ringed with carefully placed stones. Burials appeared beneath floors, connecting the living with their ancestors in the soil itself. People started returning not just to places, but to homes, and the land began to change in response. Wild cereals grew in thicker stands around encampments. Certain plants spread more easily because they were harvested and scattered again. Soil was trampled, disturbed, enriched with ash and bone. Without knowing it, these foragers were becoming gardeners, not in the way we picture rows of ordered crops, but in the deeper sense of co-creation. What happens when the land begins to remember you? The animals remembered too. Dogs, the earliest companions, had already made the leap. Born of wolves that had learned to follow human fires, they had crossed an invisible threshold. They hunted with us, slept near us, barked warnings into the dark. This partnership was not about ownership, but about mutual advantage. The dog gained warmth and scraps and protection. The human gained eyes, ears, and a friend who could smell fear before it arrived. Over generations, this bond deepened, not through command, but through cooperation. Other animals began their quiet migration toward domestication, not in cages, not on leashes, but in shadow. Pigs rooted through human waste and grew fat on what we left behind. Goats and sheep discovered the safety of proximity. Chickens, in Southeast Asia, began their slow evolution from jungle fowl to hearthside companions. Across the globe, as humans grew more rooted, the animals around them changed, biologically, behaviourally, subtly. It is easy to imagine domestication as conquest, as something we did to the world, but the archaeological record tells a gentler, more entangled story, one in which the human body changed as much as the landscape. Our jaws narrowed, our limbs adapted to new forms of labour, our guts adjusted to digest new foods, our sleep, once shaped by the rhythm of the hunt, now bent to the pace of sowing, waiting, harvesting. Was this adaptation or surrender? In this time before farming had a name, before it had a script or a system, humans were already rewriting their relationship with nature, not by declaration, but by daily habit. The path toward agriculture was not paved with intent. It was seeded with familiarity, with the slow generational knowing that the land gives back, if you stay long enough to listen. And so they stayed, not always through choice, but through possibility. A spring that never failed, a grove that fed more mouths each year, a slope where grain bent in the wind like a promise. In these places movement softened, the migration paths shortened, the stories began to root themselves not just in memory, but in geography. Landmarks took on names, trees were remembered, boulders became boundaries, and with each return to the same ground, the humans and their environment entered into something deeper than occupation. They began to shape one another's futures. What happens when you alter a landscape just by existing? Archaeologists call this process niche construction, a quiet, unintentional form of ecological engineering, where a species modifies its surroundings in ways that then feed back into its own evolution. Beavers do it with dams, earthworms do it with soil. Humans, during this early Holocene moment, began doing it with hearths and husks and footsteps. Around semi-permanent camps, new plant communities emerged. The constant tread of feet broke the soil. Fires cleared old growth and made way for pioneers like grasses and legumes. Trash heaps filled with nutrient-rich remains changed the chemistry of the earth. This was not agriculture in the modern sense, but it was the beginning of a conversation between human need and ecological response. And the land listened. In regions like the Jordan Valley, evidence of this feedback loop is everywhere. Microscopic analysis of ancient soil layers shows increasing concentrations of domesticated type cereal traits, tougher racees, non-shattering seeds, even before true cultivation began. This means the plants were already changing, not through artificial selection, but through persistent proximity. The grains that made it into the baskets, into the fire, into the next season, were those most compatible with human hands, and slowly, over centuries, the wild began to soften. Did the people notice? Perhaps not all at once. To them, each year might have felt the same. The same hills, the same seeds, the same harvest. But the record tells another story. A story of tools becoming more specialised. Sickles of flint lined with resin. Grinding stones worn deep with repetition. Storage pits dug into cool earth. These were not the actions of people preparing for change. These were the rituals of people already transformed, without realising it. And above it all, time passed in silence. No one stood on a mountaintop and declared the end of hunting and gathering. No one named this moment as revolutionary, because to name it would have required distance, and distance did not yet exist. These people lived inside the turning, inside the long, slow spiral of becoming something else, and they lived well, within cycles they did not fully control but increasingly influenced. So where exactly is the line between wild and domesticated? Between a seed that falls by chance and one that falls by design? Between presence and intention? The answer, if there is one, lies not in a moment of invention, but in an unfolding of awareness. To observe that a plant returns where it was once discarded is not to invent agriculture, but it is to witness something sacred in repetition. It is to recognise the echo in the soil. Over generations that echo grew louder, not all at once, not everywhere, but in pulses, in the slow accumulation of gestures that together formed the architecture of a new way of being. In the Euphrates basin, people began to leave behind traces of their longer stays: post holes, grindstones, dog burials. In the eastern Mediterranean, shell middens built up year after year like sedimentary stories of return. Even the fire changed. Once scattered and fleeting, hearths became central, circular, ringed with stone, reused. The fire was no longer just warmth and light. It was permanence, a centre to orbit, a place to remember. What shifts inside a person who begins to expect a return? Expecting to return is not a small thing. It means leaving behind more than footprints. It means shaping the land not just for now, but for the next season. It means saving seeds. It means thinning young shoots. It means sparing the mother goat not out of mercy, but foresight. In this kind of world, the rhythms of the hunt, fast, fierce, and final, were gradually replaced by the gentler violence of control. A violence made not with arrows, but with time, and yet it was not domination, not yet. This early phase, this proto-domestication, was still a dialogue. The plants did not obey, the animals could still wander. Drought, disease, and wildness always loomed. But the balance had shifted. For the first time, humans began to see themselves not only as participants in an ecosystem, but as authors of one. And that belief, even if unspoken, changed everything. In the hills of what is now modern-day Israel and Jordan, some Natufian groups began building stone dwellings partially dug into the earth, their foundations packed with ash and lime. These were not mere shelters, they were signs of settlement, of memory, of places made to last longer than a season. Burials beneath the floor suggested a link between the living and the dead, a rootedness that echoed the very plants growing outside. Who are we when the land begins to hold our bones? The answer to that question was still forming, but the direction was set. Across disparate regions, from the Zagros Mountains to the Nile Valley, from Anatolia to the Fertile Crescent, the same faint traces appeared. Camps becoming hamlets, harvesting becoming tending, movement becoming return. Each choice, each season, each basket of grain brought people one step closer to something irreversible. But they could not have known that. They only knew the world was changing, and they, along with it. And perhaps, beneath the surface, the plants were changing too. Their seeds grew heavier, less likely to scatter with the wind. Their stems thickened, their roots reached wider. Without knowing it, they were evolving not just for survival in the wild, but for life beside humans. They began to favour the disturbed soil around hearths, the rich layers of human waste and ash, the trampled paths where feet fell often. Their biology adapted to the cadence of human activity, just as humans, in turn, were adapting to the cycles of their growth. It was not cultivation yet, but it was influence. An invisible thread had been tied between species, And neither would walk away unchanged. This was not just a biological shift, it was an epistemological one. A dust change in how humans understood time, return, responsibility. A hunted animal demands skill, but offers nothing in return. A seed, tended and noticed, promises continuity, a future. In this shift from predation to partnership, a new form of imagination emerged, a way of seeing the world not as a constant chase, but as a long unfolding, something that could be shaped across seasons and remembered through generations. And what does it take to begin imagining the world as a garden? We often speak of the agricultural revolution as a singular event, a discovery, a leap. But revolutions burn hot. They erupt. What happened here was quieter. It was a revolution in slow motion, and it did not begin with fire or tools. It began with memory, with noticing that a plant had returned, with choosing not to follow the herd, but to wait just once more by the river, with understanding that the world could be not only observed, but persuaded. In the archaeological layers of this period, the Epipaleolithic, the early Holocene, we find not declarations, but footprints. A child's step preserved in ancient mud near a grindstone, a scattering of lentil seeds beside a fire pit, a wall built to catch floodwater, not to contain it. These are not the markings of conquest. They are the markings of entanglement, of lives becoming braided together, season by season, unknowingly building a future that would one day forget this quiet beginning. Because by the time the first furrow was deliberately ploughed, by the time the first field was enclosed, the world had already changed. Domestication was never a decision. It was a relationship, tender, strange, and irreversible. It did not begin with mastery. It began with attention, with presence, with a human hand brushing against a stalk of barley and deciding without knowing why to linger. What is the cost of that decision? What is gained and what is lost when we begin to build the world in our image? For now, there is only the whisper, in the grain, in the soil, in the slow remembering of plants and people alike, a whisper that says, stay, watch. Something is growing. The day humans stopped hunting did not end with silence. It continued, with footsteps in familiar soil, with seeds left in furrows not yet called fields, with sheep returning to the same slope again and again. What began as a flicker in the minds of foragers became a rhythm so quiet it escaped the notice of those living inside it. But beneath that quiet, the earth was turning. Something irreversible was unfolding, not with force, but with habit. And farming, as we would come to call it, began not with revolution, but with repetition. What does it mean when survival becomes practice? Across the rolling hills and fertile valleys of the Levant and Mesopotamia, the great theatre of change had already been set. Rain-fed highlands gave way to river-fed lowlands. Winters became less harsh. Summers grew longer. The wild grasses of the Fertile Crescent, barley, emmer, einkorn, flourished in these in-between spaces halfway between wilderness and human touch. Foragers who had once passed through these places began to linger. Then they returned. Then they stayed. Each year they harvested what grew, and each year, by accident or intent, some seeds remained. Those that stayed behind adapted to life near humans. They grew sturdier, less wild, less prone to scattering in the wind. And so the land changed, slowly, almost invisibly. In places like Abu Huraira and Jericho, we find the fossilized fingerprints of this transition. Sickles worn smooth from repetitive cutting. Storage pits dug deeper and lined with stone. Grinding stones with grooves deep enough to outlive generations. The houses, too, began to speak of permanence. Circular mud brick structures half sunk into the earth, arranged not for escape, but for return. Where the hunt once dictated the shape of time, now the harvest began to draw its own calendar, one of waiting, tending, storing. What happens when the land asks you to stay? Alongside the grains, something else followed. Animals, not in fear, but in familiarity. Goats and sheep, once wild climbers of rocky outcrops, began to approach human camps, drawn by discarded food, by water, by the safety of human presence. These were not yet herds, not yet property. But they hovered at the edge of fires, learned the sounds of voices, followed trails already worn by feet. Over time, their patterns shifted. They became smaller, tamer, slower to flee. And the humans changed too, learning which animals could be led, which could be milked, which would follow their young into a pen. The relationship was not ownership, not yet. It was proximity turned into pattern, and then, as patterns always do, it became structure. The hunter's muscles softened. The pace of life adjusted to the seasons of plants and the rhythms of livestock. A child born in such a world might never know the sharp thrill of the hunt, but they would know the smell of warm grain, the bleating of goats before dawn, the taste of bread shared from the same fire season after season. Was this progress, or a narrowing of the soul? Perhaps it was neither. Perhaps it was simply momentum. Once a habit forms across generations, it no longer feels like a choice. It becomes the air one breathes. In this new life of the early Neolithic, choice was replaced by timing, by readiness, by ritual. When to sow, when to reap, when to burn the chaff, when to carry lambs across the river. And through these rituals, the landscape itself began to look different. Forests were cleared, not all at once, but in slow breaths. A tree here, a patch of brush there. Wild places shrank into margins. The horizon filled with the golden hum of ripening grain, and the wild, once a partner in the dance of survival, became something to fence. In this transformation, the domesticated animals became more than just food. They became memory, continuity. A flock of sheep was a living inheritance passed down like song. A herd of goats represented not just meat and milk, but a tether to the future. Their births were timed, their breeding guided. The ones who kicked or fled were culled. The ones who followed were fed. And generation by generation, a new kind of animal emerged, one shaped not by tooth and claw, but by the warmth of the human hand. What does it mean to bend nature toward need? It is here, in this deepening entanglement between human and beast, that dogs became something more than scavengers. They were now companions, guardians, collaborators in this settled world. While sheep learned to follow, dogs learned to lead, to bark at the edges, to protect the pen, to herd. Their bond with humans, forged in the fireside shadows of the Paleolithic, now became indispensable. Their eyes read our gestures, their ears heard meaning in our voices. Together the species had braided their destinies. And still, no one called this farming. There were no words for domestic or wild. There was only the rhythm of days that had become more predictable, and in that predictability the illusion of control. In the heart of the Fertile Crescent, at sites like Chayonu and Göbekli Tepe, the architectural traces whisper of transformation not just in diet, but in mind. Buildings arranged around communal centres, stones aligned with celestial bodies, platforms cleared for gatherings of unknown purpose. These were not mere shelters, they were spaces of meaning. Somewhere along this slow march from nomadism to settlement, the human world expanded inwards. Thought became place. Ceremony found location. What new stories are born when movement gives way to rootedness? The tales of the hunt, of daring, of kill, of the open plain, began to fade. In their place, stories of harvest emerged, of growth, of cycles. The myths turned seasonal. Gods were born from grain, and death was measured not in blood, but in blight. A seed rotting in the earth became a metaphor, a warning, a prayer. This was the silent revolution, not a battle won but a breath held, not a shout but a murmur repeated until it shaped the world. And in shaping the world reshaped us. Bodies changed. Where once the long limbs of the persistence hunter stretched across open plains, now shorter statures and broader hips became more common. Bodies adapted not for running, but for staying. The joints bore the strain of grinding grain. Spines curved under the weight of harvest baskets. Teeth wore down from stone-ground bread. The skeleton, like the soil, began to carry the mark of repetition. Was it loss, or was it adaptation? In the stillness of early villages, time moved differently. The chase had been replaced by caretaking. Children learned not the flight of arrows, but the rhythm of planting. Hands once shaped to throw spears now pulled weeds and scattered seed. Knowledge shifted too. Where the hunter needed memory of terrain and timing, the farmer needed memory of soil. of moonlight, of pest and pattern. Intuition gave way to planning, and in that planning something strange happened. Humans began to think in years, not in days. For the first time, a bad decision might not kill you today, or even this week, but next harvest. And so planning stretched farther. Minds expanded toward futures they could not see. The architecture of risk changed, and with it so did the architecture of thought. What kind of mind is born from the need to wait? This waiting required cooperation. In small bands of mobile foragers, decisions had been flexible, responsive, built on shared necessity. But now, with storage pits full of grain and animals too numerous for one family to tend alone, coordination became essential. Social structures shifted, leadership began to calcify, property emerged, slowly, subtly, and often invisibly at first. A field cleared by one family might now belong to them. A herd passed down through generations could be claimed as lineage. And in this emergence of ownership, inequality crept in. The surplus, once a blessing, became leverage. Those who controlled the stores could control the seasons. Food became power. Labour became debt. The first seeds of hierarchy were not planted in malice. They were born from abundance, from the need to manage it, protect it, and distribute it. And with each new layer of coordination came new forms of responsibility and new forms of burden. Did we give up freedom for stability, or did we simply trade one danger for another? The wanderer became the settler, the campfire became the home, the trail became the boundary, and in these shifts a deeper transformation was taking place. Not in the soil, not in the animals, but in the soul. Where once life had been shaped by what could be found, it was now shaped by what could be grown. And to grow required patience. To grow required control. To grow meant believing that tomorrow would look like today, and the day after that, and the one after that too. Was this hope, or was it illusion? The illusion, if it was one, held fast. It wove itself into architecture, into ritual, into the very bones of human life. Around the eastern Mediterranean, the circular dwellings of the first villages began to flatten into rectangles. Walls straightened, corners were carved with care, rooms were partitioned, spaces delineated. This was not just a matter of convenience, it was the physical manifestation of a new worldview, one that prized boundaries, permanence, and definition. Where the campfire had once been open to the stars, the hearth was now enclosed in stone and clay. What shifts in the psyche when the horizon narrows to four walls? In that narrowing came a strange kind of security. One could sleep knowing the animals were penned, that food was stored, that neighbours were near. The wild, once immediate and sacred, became distant, an edge to be kept at bay. Children born into these villages may never have known the sound of elk herds or the trail of migrating reindeer. Instead, they knew the creak of granaries, the bleat of lambs, the rhythm of water carried from the stream. Their world was smaller but more stable. Their days were cyclical, tethered to predictable tasks, a routine that gave comfort and confinement. And yet, under this still surface, tensions brewed. The land, generous though it seemed, could tire. Replanted too often, it withered. Grazed too hard, it eroded. And when the rains did not come, the waiting turned bitter. Dependence, once a strength, now revealed its fragility. A failed harvest was not just a hardship, it was a crisis. And unlike the foragers, who could move in search of new abundance, the settlers had roots. They had invested too much into place to walk away. What does it mean to belong to the land rather than roam across it? Belonging brings beauty. It allows depth, stories woven through soil, rituals passed from threshold to threshold, generations layered in the same dust. But it also brings burden. One cannot abandon a field in drought without leaving behind a home, a history, a grave. The freedom of the hunt had been traded for the permanence of place, and permanence, once a dream, now demanded loyalty. In the margins, not everyone agreed. Some resisted this settling of spirit. Evidence from the archaeological record suggests that even as villages blossomed, some groups held tightly to mobility, merging seasonal movement with selective tending. They harvested wild plants, maintained flocks on the move, gathered where the earth still offered freely. These were not simply laggards of progress. They were choosing a different relationship with time. one that refused to collapse mystery into control, one that honoured motion as sacred. But their numbers dwindled. The tide of settlement was rising, and with it came something else, a new kind of memory. Not just oral, not just in song, but in structure, in clay tokens, in walls, in rows of sprouting grain, a memory that endured not in footsteps, but in foundations, and in those foundations, humanity laid its claim to something it had never had before: permanence. Permanence was not just in stone, it was in story, in lineage, in the idea that this place, this plot of earth, could hold not just food and shelter, but memory. Villages became settlements, settlements became communities, and with community came ceremony, not the fleeting rituals of a night around the fire, but enduring expressions of belonging. Stones were lifted into impossible alignments. Enclosures were carved not for shelter, but for gathering. Offerings were placed in pits, not to appease hunger, but to speak to the unseen forces now thought to dwell beneath the soil. What does it mean when the earth is no longer wilderness, but home? To call a place home is to believe in return. To return is to invest meaning. And in meaning, humans found not only sustenance, but identity. The domestication of wheat and barley, of sheep and goats, did more than provide calories. It provided continuity. The seed you plant becomes the food you share, becomes the body of your child, becomes the breath of your labour, becomes the offering you bury, and then, next season, becomes the seed again. This was not just agriculture. It was a cosmology, a cycle that enclosed every aspect of existence. But cycles, like walls, can also confine. Where there had once been fluidity, between groups, between roles, between seasons, there was now a growing rigidity. Labour divided, roles assigned, tasks repeated, men tilled, women ground, children fetched, elders remembered. And though these patterns may have brought order, they also created distance between power and powerlessness, between freedom and duty, between those who controlled surplus and those who laboured to sustain it. Was this civilization or captivity? Even the dogs, once companions in the wilderness, now walked the same paths each day. The goats knew their pens, the people knew their place. There was comfort in this order, but also something lost, something harder to name, a looseness, a lightness, a sense that the world could still surprise you. In trading the unpredictable for the planned, humanity gained control and gave up something older than memory. Yet within that trade lay the foundations of everything to come, because from these quiet beginnings, these silent revolutions, came cities and writing and empires, came laws and monuments and fields without end. But before all that, before the bronze and the wheel and the word, there was this: a hand scattering seed into earth made soft by rain, a goat bleating in the morning mist, a child pressing mud between their fingers, building the wall that would outlast them, and so the hunter became the planter, the wanderer, the settler, and the rhythms of earth, once chased across the horizon, were now waited for beneath a roof. What began as survival became structure, what began as habit became history, and history, once rooted, would never stop growing. 12,000 years ago, something began that would never be undone. It did not start with violence or invention, but with the promise of abundance, the sense that life, once uncertain, could now be secured in the rhythm of planted seeds and penned animals. Humanity had stopped chasing its food. It had learned to grow it. But what seemed like liberation soon became something else, a tether, a pattern, a narrowing. Because with abundance came dependency, and with dependency something ancient was lost. What if progress feels like freedom, but acts like a trap? The shift to agriculture brought food in greater quantities than ever before. Fields swelling with barley and emmer wheat, granaries filled with dried pulses, herds fattening near village, walls. Hunger no longer ruled every day. For the first time, communities could feed more mouths than they needed to. But this surplus came at a cost few could yet see. The price was movement. The price was flexibility. The price was time. Sedentism crept in, not as a single decision, but as a set of habits layered atop one another. At first, people returned to the same fertile patches each season, following the ripening of grain and the birth of livestock. Then they stayed longer, then they stayed year-round. Homes were rebuilt instead of abandoned, paths became foot-worn lanes, storage pits deepened, and gradually mobility, once essential to survival, faded into memory. What do you lose when you can no longer walk away? In the age of foragers, the ability to leave was security. If the animals vanished or the land soured, one simply moved. But farmers tied themselves to the soil. Crops required tending through cycles of sun and storm. Livestock needed daily care. The village became an anchor, a point around which everything turned, and as people stayed, they built walls, granaries, houses, boundaries. The world grew smaller, more predictable, but also more demanding. Because abundance is never free. Where a hunter might work a few hours to feed a family, the early agriculturalist laboured day after day, weeding, watering, storing, protecting. Bones from this time show the toll it took, spines compressed by burden, knees worn from kneeling, joints inflamed from repetition. Dental records reveal cavities and abscesses, signs of grain-heavy diets and constant grinding. Life may have been longer, but it was also harder, more punishing in its rhythms. Was it worth it? The evidence does not speak in certainty, but in hints, in worn hands and shortened stature, in increased disease and decreased freedom. The shift to farming created the conditions for civilization, for cities, for language carved into clay. But it also reshaped the body, the schedule, the very relationship between effort and reward. The wild foods of the past may have been unpredictable, but they asked less of the human frame. The cultivated ones promised plenty, but demanded everything in return. And in this new world, people began to serve the systems they once thought served them. The fields did not rest. Neither could the farmers. Wheat and barley waited for no one. Rain arrived too early or too late. Goats gave birth at inconvenient hours. Storage jars needed sealing against rodents. Even the simple act of living now demanded vigilance, and the rhythm that once guided human life, the open, wandering pulse of hunting, dwindled into something narrower, more monotonous, more punishing. What happens to the human spirit when every day becomes an obligation? Archaeological remains tell the story through the body. Hunter-gatherers had been tall, broad-shouldered, lithe from constant motion. Early agriculturalists shrank. Their bones record chronic stress, vertebrae compressed by carrying water and grain, elbow joints worn by grinding stones, teeth eroded by grit embedded in bread. Diseases proliferated, tuberculosis, parasites, nutritional deficiencies. To stay in one place meant to share not only food, but microbes, and overcrowded villages made perfect pathways for illness. The irony is stark. The first farmers produced more food than their ancestors ever had, yet their bodies were weaker, their health poorer, their diets less varied. Surplus did not equal well-being. It equaled responsibility, and responsibility multiplied into labour, and labour created time debts. A hunter could rest after a kill. A forager could pause between seasons. A farmer could never stop. Crops failed if neglected. Animals sickened if ignored. A single mistake, a missed rain, a late harvest, could unravel months of effort. In a world dependent on the soil, time itself became a resource to manage, to portion, to guard. Humans tried to control the land, but the land controlled the calendar. Was this mastery, or was it servitude? Into this new landscape of constant work crept another shift, one far more subtle and far more dangerous. When food became surplus, it needed guarding. When it needed guarding, someone had to do the guarding, and when some guarded while others farmed, roles diverged. Social structures thickened, power consolidated around storage, the granaries, the pens, the walls. In hunter-gatherer life, sharing had been necessity. Meat spoiled quickly, mobility discouraged hoarding, equality was woven into survival. But the moment grain stayed fresh through winter, the logic of society changed. Those who controlled the stores, the families nearer the granaries, the elders who allocated seeds, the ones who organised labour, controlled life itself. And so, hierarchy was born, not through malice, but through surplus, through the simple arithmetic of accumulation. One family produced more than another. One household guarded the seeds. One lineage oversaw the herds. Over generations, these differences crystallized. Wealth began to mean stored calories, stored animals, stored stability, and the people who held this wealth began to live differently, with more time, more choices, more security. What must it have felt like for the first human who realized that food, once shared, had become leverage? The cage was not made of bars, it was made of abundance, and abundance had rules. It asked for obedience, not to kings or gods, but to the seasons, to the soil, to a way of life that measured worth not in freedom but in yield. With surplus came structure, with structure came hierarchy, and with hierarchy came distance, not just between roles, but between people. In the village, everyone worked, but not everyone worked the same. Some bent their backs to the fields, others watched the stores, some rose early to grind and carry, while others met to plan and tally. The work remained, but its weight was no longer evenly shared. What do you become when your labour no longer belongs to you? The early settlements of the Neolithic do not reveal palaces or monuments, not yet, but they do show signs of difference. Burials with richer goods, homes closer to central spaces, cooking hearths of varying size. These clues, scattered through soil and sediment, whisper of inequality forming in real time. Not imposed from above, but grown from within. A family with a better harvest one year might trade it for favours, for tools, for help. The next year they trade less, because others owe them. And in this subtle transaction, wealth becomes something more than food. It becomes power. And power, once tasted, reshapes the mind. The moment some could control the food of others, they began to imagine different futures. Futures in which their children did not toil as much, in which their voices weighed more, in which their homes grew larger, their storage fuller. Farming allowed this dream because farming scaled. More fields meant more grain meant more trade meant more prestige, and the loop reinforced itself. But what about those at the other end of the loop? They too felt the shift, not as privilege, but as pressure. With hierarchy came expectation. With expectation came debt. The food was shared, but not equally. The labour was organised, but not voluntarily. A poor harvest did not erase your obligation. A broken tool did not delay your turn. The field, once a symbol of survival, became a ledger, and from ledgers, civilization would rise. Yet the irony persists. The earliest foragers had moved with the grace of the seasons, with no possessions they could not carry, with no obligations that bound them beyond their bonds of kin and care. Their needs were few, their lives were short, but free. The early agriculturalists, in contrast, had more of everything. More food, more shelter, more time. But their time was no longer their own. Their shelters needed maintenance. Their food required constant tending, and their surplus was never quite enough to escape the next crisis. Did they ever pause to wonder what they had traded away? Or had the new rhythm become so complete, so consuming, that they no longer remembered the shape of the wild? The wild was still out there, of course, beyond the fields, past the pastures, in the dense woods and distant hills. But it had become other, something untamed, risky, unpredictable. And what is feared is often controlled. The fence became not just a barrier for animals, but for ideas. Movement was now suspect. Wandering became the mark of outsiders. To settle was to belong. To settle was to be safe. But the price of that safety was a kind of forgetting, a severing from the deeper, older instincts that had once defined the human animal. What do we lose when the earth stops being a partner and becomes a possession? Possession changes not only how people interact with land, but how they interact with one another. As boundaries were drawn in soil, they were drawn in society. A field could be claimed, so could a granary, so could a role, a title, a name. These claims were defended, passed down, protected, and in protecting what was mine, the concept of yours emerged, not as something to share, but to keep apart. It's here, in this slow enclosure of both place and person, that inequality took root like a weed in the furrows. Some began to own more than they could consume. Others laboured for what they would never keep. A child born into a household near the granary was not just better fed. They were more secure, more respected, more likely to live long enough to inherit. And so power became generational. Caste was not yet formalised, but its shadows stretched across the early settlements. There were those who planned and those who obeyed, those who stored and those who carried, those who watched from thresholds and those who bent at the waist. How much of this did they understand, those early farmers, as the walls of their homes grew thicker? There is no single answer. But the archaeology of inequality is subtle and persistent. In some graves, we find beads, blades, ochre, and bone tools arranged with care. In others, we find almost nothing. The difference is not only in what was buried, but in what was believed. The dead speak through silence as much as through their treasures, and in that silence, we hear the echo of rising hierarchy. Not yet kings, not yet gods, but something stirring beneath the soil. Even the food itself tells this story. In one dwelling, lentils boiled in stone pots. In another, grains ground into bread. In another still, meat burned on a raised hearth. These are not differences of necessity, but of choice, of access, of privilege, of custom. What we eat becomes who we are, and in early agricultural villages the menu began to divide. Was this progress, or partition? When food ceased to be shared freely, it began to shape a new kind of hunger, not just of the body, but of the soul. Because hunger is not only about emptiness, it is about yearning for freedom, for fairness, for something remembered only vaguely in the marrow of our species, for the long-ago days when no one hoarded and no one served, when the earth was not divided by stone walls and hooped baskets of grain, but held openly in motion and trust. The transition to agriculture did not simply fill bellies, it filled ledgers, and those ledgers wrote new hierarchies into human life, and perhaps the most dangerous hierarchies were the ones that could not be seen. What happens when dependency becomes invisible? Not a cage of iron, but a cage of expectation. The new expectations were everywhere: to rise with the sun, to weed before the heat, to mend what was broken, to save for winter, to report, to obey, to repeat. The wild cycles of the hunt had allowed for flow, of rest, of adventure, of renewal. But the planted field, once sowed, gave no pause. Its promise was conditional. Its gifts required toil. It was alive, yes, but on a leash, and so humans leashed themselves to it. By the time the first villages grew into towns, the memory of movement had faded into myth. Elders spoke of the distant time when ancestors followed the stars, listened to wind, read rivers like scripture. Now, knowledge meant storage records. It meant counting sacks of grain, dividing days by labour units. The more humanity accumulated, the more it required, and the more it required, the less it could afford to stray. Even the seasons, once signs of return and renewal, became sources of pressure. Too little rain, too many mouths, too short a harvest. And when things went wrong, they no longer impacted just a family. They affected everyone. Famine became a communal collapse, drought a test of governance, and in these new crises, blame grew alongside scarcity. Why didn't you plant enough? Why didn't you store more? Why didn't you obey? From this crucible, the first murmurs of rule began to rise, because with hierarchy comes enforcement. With enforcement, a voice above others. With a voice above others, the first outlines of command. Agriculture birthed not just food, but structure. And structure, once rooted, grows teeth. How long before the granary became the throne? Yet still, this revolution was silent. It crept through days and decisions shaped by intentions no one named. It was not a fall, it was not a rise, it was a settling. A slow arrangement of life into patterns that promised plenty, and quietly extracted everything in return. And in the quiet centre of this world of walls and woven baskets, one truth settled like dust. The harvest had become the master, and the hands that once threw spears in open air now dug furrows in silence, dreaming, perhaps only in sleep, of a freedom they could no longer name. The bones do not lie. Long after the voices have faded, after the houses have crumbled and the fields have returned to dust, it is the bones that speak, softly, but with devastating clarity. They tell a story not of triumph, but of cost. Because when humanity stopped hunting and began to plant, the earth began to collect a new kind of fossil, not wild-boned wanderers, but bowed and brittle bodies, shaped by labour, narrowed by diet, and wearied by the new weight of civilization. What price was paid for the promise of permanence? Archaeology is not just about discovery. It is about consequence. And nowhere are the consequences of agriculture more vividly written than in the skeletons buried beneath the first fields. The tall, lean frames of Ice Age hunters give way to shorter, stockier figures. The bones grow denser in some places, weaker in others. Teeth rot, spines compress, knees twist and grind. These are not symbols of progress. They are symptoms of strain. Why did we shrink as our world grew? Paleopathology, the study of ancient diseases and injuries through skeletal remains, is our window into this transformation. It reveals not only how people lived, but how their lives began to change under the pressures of farming. The first farmers, for all their food, were not healthier than their foraging ancestors. In fact, they were often sicker. Their bones bear the scars of relentless motion, of repetitive tasks, of dietary narrowing. They are the architecture of unanticipated suffering, and they tell us this change was not gentle. Enamel hyperplasia, horizontal lines etched into childhood teeth, marks the body's response to early life malnutrition. Cribra orbitalia, porosity in the eye sockets, often reflects anemia, iron deficiency, or chronic infection. These signs appear with alarming frequency in Neolithic remains. They are not isolated cases. They are patterns, systemic and widespread. And the deeper archaeologists dig, the more frequent these signals become. Could abundance have created a new form of scarcity? The answer lies in the shift from diverse seasonal diets to reliance on a few staple crops. Early agriculturalists in the Fertile Crescent consumed large quantities of wheat and barley, but little else. Their meals filled the stomach, but not the body. Micronutrients disappeared. Protein intake fell, and the grindstones used to process grain filled the flour with grit, slowly wearing down teeth until chewing became a daily pain. Cavities, abscesses, and jaw infections emerge for the first time in human history, not in times of famine, but in the midst of plenty. So what kind of plenty was it? If survival means merely staying alive, then farming was a success. Populations grew, settlements flourished. But if survival also means vitality, strength, resilience, freedom from disease, then something had been lost. The bones know this. They bend under burdens carried too long. They stiffen in joints worked too hard. They fracture in patterns that speak of routine, not accident. The skeletons are not dramatic. They are quiet. But their silence is the sound of transformation. And within that transformation lies a truth humans did not intend to write. For buried in the soil beside grinding stones and broken pots, the bones reveal the oldest archives of suffering, the kind that emerges not from catastrophe, but from routine. A fractured wrist healed poorly, suggesting a fall during repetitive labour. A spine curved unnaturally from years of carrying loads across uneven ground. To farm was to endure. To endure was to break slowly, and the earth recorded every fracture. What happens when the body becomes an instrument instead of a companion? The shift from hunting to farming demanded movements far different from those shaped by the chase. Instead of sudden bursts of pursuit, farmers spent hours hunched over, cultivating soil, pulling weeds, carrying water. Such motions, repeated daily, etched themselves into the skeleton. In village after village, archaeologists uncover the same signatures: arthritic knees, inflamed shoulder joints, compressed vertebrae. These stress markers are so consistent they form a pattern, a biomechanical fingerprint of early agricultural life. But perhaps the most heartbreaking testimonies lie in the teeth. Before the rise of farming, cavities were rare. Foragers ate fibrous plants, lean meat, rich nuts, and varied roots. Their teeth show wear, yes, but wear that comes from use, not decay. Then agriculture arrived, and with it, starch. Wheat and barley, ground between stone querns, mixed with airborne grit from grinding, created flour laced with silica. Bread became a staple, and so did dental misery. Early farmers show rampant caries, abscesses that ate into bone, teeth ground flat from grit and dust. What does it feel like when your daily bread slowly destroys the mouth that eats it? And it was not only teeth that bore the cost of this dietary narrowing. Malnutrition emerged not in times of shortage, but in the very communities that believed they had conquered hunger. Skeletal remains show stunted growth, indicating childhoods deprived of essential nutrients. Porous bones speak of mineral loss. Signs of scurvy, rickets, and anemia appear not sporadically but predictably. The Earth did not judge this new way of eating, it simply recorded its effects. Yet the story gets heavier still. The rise of agriculture did not impact all bodies equally. In graveyards where men and women lie side by side, the differences tell an unmistakable story. Women's skeletons often show more severe signs of wear, deeper grooves in humeri from grinding grain, more pronounced arthritis in knees from hours spent kneeling, more stress fractures associated with repetitive domestic labour. Their teeth show more cavities, reflecting both diet and the demands of pregnancy and breastfeeding in a world with scarce micronutrients. Was this the first emergence of gendered suffering? It is not a conclusion forced from ideology, but drawn from bone. The division of labour hardened in these early farming communities. Men tended to fields and herds, women processed grain, hauled water, cared for children, and maintained the home. Over time, these roles calcified, literally, into the bodies they inhabited. The skeletons whisper this division with eerie clarity. They show its cost without exaggeration. And beneath these gendered differences, another layer forms, one that shadows the rise of inequality itself. And beneath these gendered differences, another layer forms, one that shadows the rise of inequality itself. Social stratification did not arrive with armies or temples. It arrived with differing burdens written quietly into the body. In early farming communities, not all bodies told the same story of labour, pain, or scarcity. Some showed signs of stress, overuse, and deprivation. Others, buried with beads, blades, or goods, told a different story, one of exemption. The distinction was not always dramatic, but it was consistent. Inequality had begun to leave its trace in bone. How does a body become an artifact of its social class? The evidence lies in differential nutrition, workload, and burial treatment. Among the same village population, we see children who grew tall and strong, and others stunted and frail. We find skeletons with healed injuries suggesting access to care, and others with untreated trauma, cracked ribs, fractured limbs, left to mend alone or not at all. In societies where surplus food existed, it was not equally shared. Where effort was demanded, it was not evenly distributed. Some shoulders carried more than others. This subtle divergence becomes a kind of silent census, a biological ledger of inequality. Graves reinforce this stratification. In Çatalhöyük, one of the earliest large Neolithic settlements, some individuals were buried with elaborate goods, tools of obsidian, figurines, decorated clothing. Others were laid to rest with little or nothing. Even the placement of the dead within the settlement reflects emerging hierarchies, some beneath central rooms, others beneath thresholds or outer spaces. The message is simple. Not all lives were remembered the same, and if not all lives were remembered equally, were they lived equally? The physical record says no. Inequality, once rooted, became embodied, not in monuments or edicts, but in femurs, teeth, and spines. It manifested in access to protein, in exposure to disease, in the endurance of toil, in the ways some were spared the worst of subsistence, and others bore it daily. These were not yet the grand chasms of empire or caste, but they were the first cracks, and once cracks form, they deepen. What did it mean to be born into a body destined for labour? The answer again lies in patterns. Among women's skeletons, we find disproportionate wear on dominant sides, shoulders and elbows, suggesting habitual grinding, pounding and lifting. Among the poor, tooth loss occurred earlier. In men of lesser status, vertebrae suggest lifetimes of bending and lifting heavy loads. Childhood malnutrition weakened immune systems before adulthood began. These markers, invisible in life, became clear only in death. They reveal a world where even before writing, power had already shaped the body. And through that shaping, a new kind of memory was born, not held in stories, but in structure. Because while myths can fade and tools can break, the human skeleton endures, and the story it tells, of endurance, inequity, adaptation, is neither triumphant nor tragic. It is simply true, and that truth is not a condemnation. It is a mirror. The bones reflect choices made not out of malice, but out of necessity, adaptation, and the slow drift of habit becoming structure. No one intended for farming to create suffering. No one designed inequality with a blueprint, but the moment food could be stored, measured, and divided, the seeds of stratification were planted. The body, ever honest, recorded the harvest. What we do to survive reshapes what it means to be human. This reshaping was not limited to bones alone. It extended into the rhythms of reproduction, community, and even mortality. Hunter-gatherers, on average, gave birth to fewer children. Long gaps between births were maintained through mobility, breastfeeding, and cultural patterns of spacing. In contrast, agricultural life, stable, sedentary, and demanding, encouraged earlier and more frequent births. The result was population growth, but also maternal depletion. Women's skeletons show signs of repeated pregnancies, pelvic strain, calcium loss, dental decay. The body became a field itself, sown again and again. And with more births came more deaths. Infant mortality was high in early villages. Crowded living, proximity to waste, exposure to domesticated animals, all created conditions ripe for disease. Without modern sanitation, communities became breeding grounds for bacteria. The bones of children, when found, often show signs of infection, stunted growth, or trauma. These were the hidden costs of settlement, not just how people lived, but how often they died. Even burial itself became a form of memory, selective, symbolic, and unequal. In some cultures, children were buried beneath thresholds, as if woven into the architecture of the home. Others were left unmarked, their resting places forgotten. Adults too received differential treatment. Some were curled with care, surrounded by grave goods and pigments. Others were buried hastily or anonymously. These acts tell us how a society valued, or overlooked, certain lives. And over time, these choices hardened into customs. Customs became norms. Norms became systems. And so, the earth became not only a place to plant seeds, but a place to plant stories. Stories told through bone. Each excavation reveals another chapter. A woman with worn knees and a broken tibia, buried with no offerings. A man with intact teeth and broad shoulders, laid among tools of prestige. A child with porous bone, a sign of malnutrition, cradled in a shallow grave. These are not characters in a myth. They were people, once warm with breath, now remembered only by the shape they left behind. In these remains we glimpse the unintended architecture of civilization. The rise of agriculture was not just about food, it was about labour, hierarchy, reproduction, and suffering. Distributed unevenly, yet felt across every generation. The bones do not moralise, but they do remember, and what they remember is that change, once begun, does not ask permission. It ripples outward, reshaping every joint, every meal, every moment of rest. And in time, it reshapes what a body must endure simply to belong. To belong in a village was to be useful, to carry, to grind, to bear children, to produce. And with every generation, the human form adapted less to the wilderness and more to the burdens of structure. The strong legs of the runner became the calloused knees of the planter. The powerful shoulders of the hunter gave way to the hunched frame of the thresher. The body became not just a vessel of survival, it became a tool of labour. But what happens when the tool begins to break? In later Neolithic communities, we see the echoes of wear deepen into degeneration. Osteoarthritis appears early, in individuals no older than 30. Spinal compression from heavy loads becomes nearly universal. Elbow joints flare and swell from decades of pounding grain. These are not the wounds of war or accident. They are the echoes of the everyday, the body's quiet surrender to repetition. Still, the most haunting lessons come not from the broken bones, but from what they represent. That the shift to agriculture, for all its abundance, narrowed more than the diet. It narrowed the body's range of motion. It narrowed social roles. It narrowed the meaning of health, from something lived in relationship with the land to something endured in service to it. We often think of progress as forward motion, but bones teach us that progress may also mean trade. And what was traded was diversity, of food, of movement, of identity, for security, stability, and the hope of surplus. In that exchange, humanity gained much, but it also surrendered things it didn't yet know were valuable. When the hunter laid down the spear for the sickle, the gesture seemed simple, even wise. But in the long story of our species, it was a turning. The skeleton, more than any artifact, tells us how permanent that turning became. For here is the paradox. The same bones that show signs of suffering also show signs of adaptation. Joints thicken in response to repeated use. Bones strengthen where needed. Spines adjust to years of bending. Even pain, when prolonged, becomes part of what a body accepts as normal. And so, while the costs were high, the species endured. It learned to live within this cage of abundance. It moulded itself around the rhythms of the plough, the grindstone, the fire. And that too is a kind of resilience, not heroic, but humble. Today we walk on the bones of these ancestors, often unaware of the long line of endurance beneath our feet. Their lives were not short stories. They were slow inscriptions in calcium and marrow, shaped by hunger, labour, love, and fatigue. And when the wind uncovers them, in fields, in riverbanks, beneath layers of dust, we're reminded not only of how far we've come, but of how deeply that journey lives within us. Because in the end, it is the bones that remember. This is the unsettling truth at the heart of our story. A quiet reversal that crept into our lives over generations, so slowly we didn't notice until the transformation was complete. We think of farming as a choice, a clever invention that gave us power over nature. But in truth, it was wheat, or barley, or millet, or rice that domesticated us. We bent our backs to its rhythms. We rebuilt our villages, reshaped our diets, restructured our societies, not for our sake, but for its. It grew, and so we changed. What does it mean to be ruled not by a king, but by a grass? The first clues lie not in myth or writing, but in biology. Archaeologists and evolutionary biologists now speak of agricultural dependency, the idea that farming didn't simply help us survive, but locked us into a one-sided relationship. Wild wheat once grew freely across the Levant, but it was fickle, its seeds scattered on the wind, its harvest brief. Early humans began to favour the strains that clung tighter to the stalk, that ripened together, that yielded predictably, and so, generation by generation, the wheat changed. But in return, so did we. Our hands grew calloused not from the hunt, but from the harvest. Our bodies became tools not of movement, but of maintenance. And the more we relied on these plants, the more they required from us. Fields had to be cleared, irrigation dug, weeds pulled, stored grain guarded, planting seasons planned. Year after year, the calendar wrapped tighter around the needs of the crop. Dependence didn't arrive with chains, it arrived with tasks, and those tasks began to shape the structure of our days, our families, our gods. Because when survival depends on a field, the field becomes sacred. And what does the field feed? Not just the body, but the world inside it. Our gut, a co-evolutionary mirror of our diet, transformed. Microbiologists examining ancient DNA and coprolite remains, fossilized human feces, have found evidence of dramatic changes to the human gut microbiome with the rise of grain agriculture. Before farming, the human digestive system hosted a vast diversity of bacteria, tuned to break down varied plant fibers, wild meats, nuts, and tubers. But with a narrow grain-based diet, that diversity began to vanish. Certain bacterial species dwindled, others overgrew. Inflammation rose. Our internal ecosystem became as domesticated as the world outside. Could it be that we didn't just farm the land, we farmed ourselves? The consequences were not immediate. They never are. But over generations, these subtle shifts echoed through the genome. Enzymes for starch digestion became more prevalent. Amylase gene copy number increased, the body adapting to a flood of carbohydrates. Meanwhile, tolerance for dietary variety diminished. Cultural traditions followed suit. Whole civilizations began to base their identity on wheat and barley, on rice and millet, on corn and cassava. And with each meal, a bargain was reinforced. The wheat would feed us if we lived by its rules, and so we did. Across continents and cultures, we rebuilt our entire lives to serve its cycle. We gave up roaming for rootedness. We synchronized our time, not by the stars alone, but by the sowing and the reaping. We invented calendars to honor the seasons, gods to guard the harvest, and rituals to beg the sky for rain. Entire languages evolved with words for planting, ploughing, and threshing. And through it all, wheat watched us, not with eyes, but with replication, expansion, and a quiet tightening of grip. Dependency is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is ritual. We often think of domestication as a human act, that we tamed the wild, bent it to our will. But the theory of agricultural dependency invites a haunting inversion. Wheat, barley, rice, they spread through us, shaping our movements, habits, and even genes to better serve their propagation. These plants could not move, but we could. And so we did. Across the hills of Anatolia, the plains of Mesopotamia, the river valleys of India and China, we carried them, not as masters, but as vectors. We did not just cultivate the grain, we became its vehicle, and within this relationship the body continued to change. A new world formed in the gut, fed daily by starch and stripped of diversity. As grain became our staple, our microbiomes shrank. The thousands of species that once thrived in symphony within us began to wither. This was not just about digestion. The gut, modern science now understands, is deeply tied to immunity, cognition, and mood. What vanished from our intestines may have reshaped our minds. Could this dietary monotony have altered the very way we think and feel? We don't know yet, but evidence grows. Studies comparing the gut flora of modern industrialized populations to that of traditional foragers, like the Hadza of Tanzania, show stark contrasts. Foragers host richer, more adaptable microbiomes, better suited to metabolize fiber, ward off infection, and regulate inflammation. Agricultural societies, on the other hand, tend to harbour reduced diversity, a gut flora streamlined by generations of grain, sugar, and low fibre. And if the gut is an orchestra, our instruments have gone missing. Cultural expressions mirrored this internal shift. The birth of farming coincides with new notions of control, over the land, over the body, over time. This control extended outward, but also turned inward. With domestication came rules, boundaries, norms. Sedentism demanded order, labour demanded hierarchy, and hierarchy demanded compliance. Grain was no longer just food, it was structure, it was law, it was rhythm. A bowl of porridge in the morning, bread at noon, gruel at night, a slow drumbeat that set the pace of civilization. And in following that beat, we began to forget what it sounded like to roam, to forage, to feast with the forest. The wild diet, messy, varied, abundant in texture and flavour, was traded for uniformity. It filled us, it sustained us, but it did not nourish all of us equally. This inequality was not just economic or social, it was biological. As agriculture spread, it did not improve the human condition, for everyone. In many cases, it stratified it. Grain-based societies became engines of surplus, yes, but also of scarcity. Those who controlled the granaries, the storehouses, the harvest schedules, they flourished. But those who laboured under the sun, who ate from the lower bins, who consumed the husk while others ate the heart, they paid the cost. And that cost echoed not just in the body, but in the genome. Human genetics began to reflect the pressures of this new diet and lifestyle. Populations that adopted agriculture show distinct changes in genes related to metabolism, immunity, and digestion. The rise of celiac disease, gluten intolerance, and carbohydrate-related conditions like type 2 diabetes are not modern phenomena alone. They are the result of thousands of years of constrained adaptation. Our bodies evolved in a state of abundance, but that abundance was narrow. And when you feed a species one thing for millennia, the body adjusts, but not always gracefully. Wheat sculpted us, even when we didn't notice its hand. Our relationship with this crop became less like tool use and more like a contract, unwritten, but binding. In exchange for calories, we offered obedience. We planted on schedule, we stored, counted, taxed. And over time, we forgot that other foods even existed. Wild greens, tubers, nuts, insects, berries, once staples, now became weeds or pests. What didn't fit into the agricultural frame was not only neglected, it was erased. This wasn't just about what we ate, it was about what we remembered. Cultural amnesia followed the rise of the plough. Oral traditions that once spoke of forest law, animal migrations, edible roots, and seasonal abundance began to fade. In their place arose myths of sowing and reaping, harvest gods, flood cycles, and divine granaries. The sacred became tied to the cultivated, the wild became feared, and so, in our stories, as in our stomachs, wheat took root, and root it did, so deeply that it became synonymous with civilization itself. To be civilized increasingly meant to farm, and to farm meant to grow grain. Cities rose where wheat could thrive. Roads were built to transport it. Armies marched to secure it. Even taxation, the first apparatus of the state, was often measured in sheaves and sacks. Wheat became the language of empire, and in serving it, we didn't just change our diets, we changed our values. Regularity replaced spontaneity, quantity replaced diversity, ownership replaced sharing. And still, the crop grew, taller, denser, more productive. Selective breeding made it yield more per acre. Irrigation made it flourish where it once could not. But the human body, slower to adapt, began to falter. Gut inflammation, autoimmune flares, chronic fatigue. The symptoms of dependency showed not in famines but in fullness, because being fed is not the same as being nourished. And a full stomach is not always a free one. For all its bounty, wheat did not come, without conditions. Every harvest was a promise and a threat. If the rains failed, or pests swarmed, or rot spread through the granaries, the food vanished. The very system that had freed us from the uncertainty of hunting now introduced a new kind of fragility, one that was systemic, not seasonal. Dependence on a single crop meant vulnerability, and that vulnerability wove itself into politics, into power, into fear. Hunger became not an absence of food, but a failure of control. The earliest records of famine and rationing are not from foraging societies. They are from the great grain states, Egypt, Sumer, the Indus Valley. These were civilizations that had mastered the growth and storage of food, yet still found themselves held hostage by it. Flood cycles, droughts, locusts, all became existential threats, not just to the stomach, but to the structure of society. When wheat stumbled, entire cities fell. Temples turned to tombs. Gods were blamed. And always, the people returned to the field. The field was no longer a garden. It was a demand. With that demand came deeper hierarchies. As wheat fed empires, it also fed division. Farmers worked the land but did not own it. Labourers ground the grain but did not feast from it. The wealth generated by the harvest did not stay in the hands that pulled it from the soil. Instead, it travelled upward, to priests, to kings, to scribes and merchants. Grain became currency, bread became control, and through that control wheat became law. This shift echoed into the very idea of governance. Where once decisions were communal, made around the fire by consensus or song, now they were inscribed on tablets, enforced by soldiers, tallied by bureaucrats. Grain required counting, and counting required authority. Storage demanded walls, and walls demanded guards. The logic of wheat was the logic of centralization. To feed many, a few had to rule, or so the story went. But beneath that story was a quieter truth. The wheat ruled all. It ruled not by command, but by consequence. The more we built around it, fields, laws, gods, armies, the less we could imagine living without it. It had colonized the imagination. To question wheat was to question order itself. And so we stopped questioning. We called this progress. We praised our cleverness. We looked at empty stomachs and saw only logistical failure, never the seed of the system itself. And all the while the body remembered. It remembered the aches of monodiets, the fatigue of malnutrition, the rising tides of metabolic disease. It remembered the inflammation, the bloating, the chronic hunger masked as fullness. And still we chewed. Because to eat wheat was to stay alive, even if the life it sustained was narrowed, measured, and brittle. The wheat had not just become our food, it had become our fate. And yet, like all fates, it began with a choice, or something that looked like one. A few seeds scattered on fertile soil, a harvest, gathered and stored. A return to that same place, season after season. None of it seemed momentous at first, but the inertia of these choices, layered over centuries, hardened into inevitability. What was once an option became a necessity. What was once an experiment became identity. We did not merely cultivate wheat. We rewrote our destiny around it. In the deep corridors of time, the idea of domestication, so often imagined as mastery, reveals itself as entanglement. The wheat, passive and rooted, grew only with our labour, and we, mobile and restless, stayed only with its promise. Its success was our constraint, its proliferation, our confinement, its abundance, our narrowing. We grew together, but not equally, and in doing so, we lost something older than memory. We lost the wide, wandering life that once defined us. There are echoes of that older life still, in the few remaining forager societies, in seeds that sprout without ploughs, in the microbial languages that still whisper through wild food. But they are faint. The world we inherited is a grain-fed world. Cities and nations, wars and treaties, language and law, all built atop the quiet dominance of a plant that learned, somehow, to harness the hands that once harvested it. And so we return to the haunting inversion, that we did not tame wheat. It tamed us. This is not a parable of doom. It is a meditation on entanglement, how deep time reveals relationships we mistake for tools, and how power does not always roar. Sometimes it grows quietly in rows, it rustles in the wind, it bakes into bread and buries into ritual, and through it we are reminded that civilization is not only made of choices, but of consequences we didn't intend to keep, and perhaps we no longer need to. Today, we begin to understand what was invisible to our ancestors. The gut is not just an organ, it is a community. The diet is not just fuel, it is information. The field is not just a source of grain, it is a mirror. We are not cursed by wheat, nor betrayed by it, but we are shaped by it, more deeply than we ever imagined. And as we face new questions of health, climate, equity, we may yet find wisdom in revisiting the stories we assumed were finished, because wheat still grows, but so does understanding, so does awareness, and perhaps so too does the capacity to choose again, to walk slowly through the grain and remember the time before it, the body before it, the mind before it. Not to reject what came, but to see it clearly, to know without fear that we are not only the farmers of the earth, but sometimes too its harvest. The wheat did not only shape our bodies, it shaped our beliefs. Somewhere between the stone and the seed, a new kind of presence emerged. Not entirely human, not quite natural, yet intimately familiar. It whispered in the rustle of barley heads, in the thud of mortars grinding grain, in the blood-dark soil of the freshly ploughed. Earth? Before we built cities, we built altars. Before we crowned kings, we carved gods. And among the earliest were gods not of war, but of grain. What must it have felt like to stand before the unknowable forces that made the fields grow? As the hunter's rhythm faded, the farmer's calendar took hold, and with it, a craving for order. No longer could the mystery of life be read in tracks through snow or the calls of migrating birds. The new world was slower, subtler, more dependent. It required patience, it required hope, and perhaps most of all, it required story. In the cradle of this new storytelling, something extraordinary appeared. A ring of stone pillars buried beneath millennia of dust, resting on a hill that once overlooked a fertile crescent of grass and game. Göbekli Tepe, a name whispered now in reverence, predates writing, pottery, and even agriculture as we know it. Yet here, more than 12,000 years ago, human hands erected monuments to something greater, something invisible, something that suggests the sacred came not after the plough, but before it. Could it be that farming began not with a shovel, but with a prayer? The massive T-shaped pillars, many weighing more than 10 tons, were carved with animals: vultures, snakes, foxes, boars, creatures of the wild. And yet the structure itself is not wild. It is deliberate, circular, ordered, a gathering place, a site of ceremony. And what, in a world not yet bound to fields, would demand such effort? What would call wandering bands of hunter-gatherers to labour for years on a hilltop they would not inhabit? Perhaps it was not agriculture that birthed religion, but religion that beckoned agriculture into being. Imagine a gathering, seasonal perhaps, where the people came not to plant, but to witness, to mark the turning of the sun, to bury the dead, to dance, to mourn, to remember. And in the midst of those ceremonies food would be needed, offerings would be made, plants would be gathered and perhaps left behind. Seeds dropped near water, grains germinating in disturbed earth, a ritual repeated yearly, unknowingly sowing the beginnings of domestication. Not a farm, but a shrine where wheat began to grow. And if the gods lived here, in this circle of stone and silence, then what grew around them was surely touched by the divine. The grain became sacred, the harvest a covenant, the soil, a vessel of meaning, and slowly the roles reversed. The place of worship became a place of work, the offerings became the meal, the shrine became the centre of a new way of life, and in that shift, belief and biology intertwined. As the people returned to the same sacred hills, the same carved stones, the same ritual gatherings, the land around Göbekli Tepe began to change. Wild wheat, corn, the ancestor of so many future fields, grew thick in the surrounding valleys. It fed the ceremonies, and the ceremonies in turn fed the grain. Seeds clung to baskets, to clothing, to the fur of animals brought for sacrifice or slaughter. When scattered, they sprouted again, not in random patches, but in places where humans returned, sang, mourned, and carved. What happens when worship becomes ecological engineering? The ceremonies may have been spiritual, but their effects were ecological, genetic, and, perhaps above all, cultural. Plants that grew near gathering sites were the ones harvested most. Harvested plants were the ones whose seeds travelled. Seeds that travelled far were the ones that endured. And the plants that endured were those that happened to align with human ritual, with human desire, with human patience. It was not agriculture yet, but it was not wildness either. It was coevolution, hidden beneath the language of devotion. But why gather at all? What force pulled people toward carved pillars on a barren hill? The answer may lie in the psychological landscape of early agriculture. As people shifted from a world of immediate rewards, the hunt, the forage, to a world of delayed outcomes, they needed more than tools. They needed meaning to explain the waiting, meaning to justify the labour, meaning to steady the hands that planted seeds and hoped for rain. And so they created myths not of chaos, but of order, cycles, returns, promises written into the sky. These were myths of fertility, both literal and symbolic. Across the ancient Near East, the earliest deities take forms tied to renewal: the mother with broad hips, the bull with thick neck and curling horns, the serpent shedding old skin, the vulture circling above the dead yet promising transformation. The earth itself became a womb, receiving the seed and returning life. In this worldview, planting was not just a task, it was an invocation, a negotiation with forces larger than the self. What must it have felt like to believe that every grain carried a soul? These myths did more than comfort, they structured society. If the harvest depended on unseen forces, then someone had to interpret those forces. Priests, shamans, seers, roles that did not exist in the same way for nomadic groups, took shape. They oversaw rituals, advised on timing, mediated between the living and the divine. Power crystallized around knowledge of the sacred calendar, and with power came hierarchy. Not all could speak to the gods of rain and grain. Thus belief and agriculture matured together, spiraling tightly. The field became a temple, the temple, a calendar, the calendar, a law. And slowly, subtly, reverence became obedience. Life bent toward the rhythm of the sacred cycle, an echo of the very crops that sustained it, looping endlessly through death and rebirth. And as the wheat grew taller, so too did the gods who guarded it. They emerged not only in stone and symbol, but in the structure of belief itself. Agriculture required explanation. Why did the rains not come? Why did the grain rot in storage? Why did one field flourish while another failed? These were not yet scientific inquiries, they were existential. And where the eye could not see cause, the spirit imagined intention. The gods became stewards of the inexplicable, personifying the hidden variables of a fragile, cultivated world. Thus, across early agrarian cultures, myths of fertility and divine cycles flourished. From Mesopotamia came Inanna, goddess of fertility and war, whose descent into the underworld marked a symbolic death and return of vegetation. From Egypt, Osiris, god of agriculture, who was dismembered and reassembled, his resurrection a metaphor for the sprouting of grain from the broken earth. In Anatolia, the Great Mother and her dying consort echoed the same theme: life, death, and return, tied intimately to the agricultural year. And in these stories, the seed was more than sustenance. It was a soul, buried in darkness, returning only through faith and toil. The harvest became a reenactment of these myths. Planting was a kind of burial, waiting, a kind of mourning. The first green shoots, a resurrection, and the reaping, at once a triumph and a loss. Each season mirrored the human condition, our fragility, our dependence, our hope. To sow was to believe in a future. To harvest was to acknowledge mortality. These rituals did not only explain the natural world, they stitched people into its rhythm, and this rhythm came to define time itself. Agriculture necessitated calendars, and calendars necessitated cosmologies. The heavens became maps of the season. The stars told when to plant, when to water, when to wait. And so the gods lifted from the earth and lodged themselves in the sky. The celestial and the terrestrial became one continuous circuit of divine order, as above, so below. To live rightly was to align oneself with this cosmic pattern, and those who claimed knowledge of this pattern held power. Religious elites rose not merely to mediate spiritual concerns, but to manage agricultural logistics. Temples stored grain, priests forecast seasons, ritual calendars dictated civic life. The economy of the sacred became inseparable from the economy of the field. And because grain was life, and life was divine, even rebellion became difficult. Disobeying the temple was not just sacrilege, it was starvation. Faith was not optional in a world ruled by the harvest, and yet through all this, belief retained its intimacy. The fertility goddess was not a distant deity of thunder and war. She was the soil beneath the fingertips, the curve of the crescent moon, the red pulse of the pomegranate. The sacred was not imposed from above, but drawn from within the land itself, from the unexplainable miracle that dry seeds could die and rise again. And in that rising, humans found something to revere, not just in gods or grain, but in the patterns that bound them. The world, once wild and unpredictable, now turned like a great wheel, guided by forces both visible and unseen. Each seed buried in spring promised a return in autumn. Each furrow ploughed was a sign of hope, not just for food, but for order. And that order was divine. The divine was no longer remote, dwelling beyond the stars or hidden in the hunt. It was here, in the furrows of the earth, in the cycle that bound death to rebirth. In this cosmology, agriculture was not just survival, it was sanctity. Fields became spaces of ritual. Harvest festivals emerged, where communities came together not only to gather food, but to reenact their place in the grand rhythm. Offerings were made, dances performed, songs sung in ancient dialects whose meanings were often forgotten, but whose repetition still anchored the people to each other, to their past and to the land. The feast was not merely a meal, it was communion, a reaffirmation that life, though fragile, would continue. But not all rituals were celebratory. Fear shaped faith too. Drought, pestilence, rot. These were not mere misfortunes. They were signs, omens, punishments. The failure of a harvest could not simply be explained by weather. There had to be fault, a ritual missed, a taboo broken, a god displeased. Thus, the spiritual burden grew heavier. With every season, the stakes rose. To misread the divine rhythm was to invite catastrophe. A single failed crop could mean hunger. 2, death. Religion, once a comfort, also became a surveillance of self, of neighbour, of the sacred. And from this scrutiny emerged structure. Religious codes merged with civil law. Tithes were paid in grain. Sacred dates became civic mandates. The temple calendar determined planting times, harvest days, and festivals. Even marriage and birth were timed to the seasons. Life was braided into agriculture, and agriculture was braided into myth. To disbelieve the gods of the harvest was not only impious, it was impractical. It was dangerous. Community cohesion relied on collective ritual, on shared belief. In this way, myth became memory, and memory became institution. Göbekli Tepe, though abandoned long before the rise of cities, remains a monument to this spiritual architecture. Its stones, buried deliberately by the very people who built them, suggest not a collapse, but a transition. As agriculture grew more central, the nature of the sacred shifted. No longer did the people need to return to a single hill. The gods of the harvest had followed them, into the fields, into the hearth, into the bones of daily life. Faith no longer needed a monument. It lived in the routine, in the lifting of the hoe, the sharpening of the sickle, the kneading of dough, the setting of sun over golden fields. These were the new rituals. Small silent gestures that reaffirmed a contract forged not in thunder but in seed. A covenant between human and soil. A whisper that said, if we serve the earth, it may yet serve us. But even whispers can become commands. What began as reverence gradually calcified into requirement. What was once devotion became duty. And in time, the gods of the harvest, born of mystery, nurtured in awe, became regulators of behaviour, enforcers of order. Their myths no longer merely explained the world, they prescribed how to live within it. The cycles of fertility and renewal, once metaphors, became blueprints. Every social role, every seasonal labour, every expectation of birth and death was folded into a divine choreography. The gods did not only dwell in the grain, they dwelled in hierarchy. Fertility goddesses became patrons of marriage and childbearing. Agricultural deities demanded not just sacrifice but surplus. The harvest became both a miracle and a metric. A bountiful yield was proof of favour, a failed one an accusation. In such a world, the distinction between the sacred and the social blurred. Temples housed not only idols, but granaries, ledgers, scribes. Religion did not retreat into silence. It was institutionalized, etched into stone, sealed in clay tablets, managed by priesthoods. And beneath this architecture of faith, the fields still grew. They grew according to the rhythms of the earth, but also according to the expectations of men. Agriculture, which had once been a response to the land's abundance, was now coerced into productivity. Fields were expanded, seasons were stretched, labour was intensified. The gods demanded offerings, and so the people toiled, believing not just in hunger, but in consequence. Yet belief was not bondage, it was also beauty. The mythologies that grew alongside agriculture were not only tools of control, they were vessels of wonder. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the hymns to Inanna, in the quiet rituals of the Anatolian plains, we find something more than fear. We find yearning, a desire to make sense of our place in the vastness, a hope that, by aligning ourselves with nature's deeper rhythm, we might find peace, or at least continuity. To sow a seed is still to say, I believe tomorrow will come. That belief, more than any temple or tablet, may be the most enduring legacy of the gods of the harvest. Because even in a secular world, even in a time when satellites predict the rains and drones survey the soil, we still kneel to plant, still wait, still hope. The spirit that first stirred at Göbekli Tepe, that reached upward through carved stone and downward into loamy earth, still lingers in our gestures. It lingers in the way we touch the soil, in the silence before a meal, in the grief of famine and the joy of fruit. The gods of the harvest were not erased by time, they were absorbed into practice, into memory, into metaphor. And though their names have changed, or vanished altogether, their presence remains, not in thunder, not in fire, but in the slow turning of seasons, in the golden hush of a ripe field, in the quiet awe that something buried can rise again, and perhaps so can we. They did not build walls because they were powerful, they built them because they were afraid. And fear in the Neolithic world was a new kind of presence. It was not the sharp, momentary panic of the hunted, that ancient reflex honed on the open plains. No, this fear was slower, quieter, persistent. It crept in at night when the granaries were full and the doors were locked. It grew in the silence between planting and harvest, because for the first time, humans had something to lose. And with that came the terrible awareness. The more you have, the more you must protect. What had once been seasonal camps along rivers and lakes began to harden into permanence. The soil was generous, the crops reliable, and so the people stayed. But permanence brought new problems. A roaming band could pick up and leave at the first sign of danger or drought. A settled village could not. The storage pits and clay jars filled with barley and emmer wheat could not be carried on the back. And so the first defensive instincts emerged not as weapons, but as thresholds, boundaries between inside and out, between what belonged and what threatened. When you build a fence, whom do you keep out? And more subtly, whom do you now call in? The rise of private property, as of grain held over the winter, of land tilled by specific hands, began to shift the shape of human relationships. Before, the world was a commons, and food was the shared fruit of the day's effort. But now the field behind your home was not just dirt. It was a season's labour, a family's survival, a lineage's claim. Territoriality, once the domain of animals, entered the human vocabulary not as instinct but ideology. The villages of Çatalhöyük, of Jericho, of Tell Sultan tell this story in baked mud and plastered walls. They show us rooms stacked beside rooms, houses touching like bricks, with no streets between them, only rooftops and ladders. This architecture speaks of a people who lived together but not always in trust. Entry came from above, exits were narrow, and doorways were few. Jericho went further, wrapping its dwellings in stone walls and a great tower, a monument to watchfulness, a symbol of suspicion. Was it raiders they feared? Wild animals? Or simply each other? The archaeological record cannot always answer, but the signs are there. Arrowheads embedded in bone, fire-blackened floors, mass graves with wounds not caused by time. Violence was no longer only the accident of hunger or competition. It was becoming something planned, organised. In the surplus of the Neolithic came the birth of ambition. In ambition, jealousy. In jealousy, conquest. And so the First War was not a battle over ideas or vengeance. It was over grain. What does it mean when survival depends not just on nature, but on others' restraint? What happens when the danger is no longer outside the forest, but standing at your neighbour's gate? You build the gate higher. You teach your children not just how to plant, but how to guard. You store your food behind, clay walls, and sleep beneath a roof, listening for the unfamiliar footfall, the snapped twig, the silence that feels too heavy. The Neolithic village was a place of shelter, but also of surveillance. Trust still lived there, but it was flanked by caution. And caution, like cultivation, grew season by season. The rise of sedentism demanded more than walls. It demanded control, of time, of land, of access. Property, once unthinkable in a foraging world, began to shape identity. To own was to exist in relation. This is my field. That is your house. That is her garden plot. Boundaries became not just physical but conceptual. They lived in the mind long before they were marked with fences or stone. Territory was no longer just ecological, it was social, legal, spiritual. To cross into someone else's field without permission was no longer curiosity, it was trespass. And yet, these early villages were not fortresses. They were woven from cooperation as much as competition. People still shared ovens, passed down seeds, gathered for rituals. But something had shifted. The openness of the Paleolithic, the communal fire around which meat and stories were shared, now stood beside locked storerooms. Granaries became symbols of survival and of temptation. A well-stored cache could feed a family through winter or invite envy from one that had less. The line between neighbour and rival grew thinner. It is here, in this subtle narrowing, that we glimpse the earliest seeds of organised violence. Conflict had always existed, but it was different now. In a mobile world, conflict was a disruption, a brief skirmish, a moment of clash, then movement. But in a settled world, conflict was a possibility that lingered. You couldn't leave, you had to resolve, or prepare, and preparation meant weapons, walls, alliances. The architecture of defence is the architecture of anticipation. Take Jericho, one of the world's oldest known cities. Its famous wall, thick and tall, was not an afterthought, it was foundational. It rose before pottery, before metallurgy, and at its base, a tower, a silent sentinel, its shadow sweeping across the earth like the hand of time itself. Scholars debate its purpose. Was it defence, ceremony, a clock measuring the sun's descent? Perhaps it was all of these, but at its heart it signals a new kind of human awareness, the fear of what lies beyond the known. When we draw lines around our lives, we draw shadows too. And in those shadows, strangers begin to form, not because they were always dangerous, but because we no longer saw them as us. The invention of the other began not with hate, but with granaries, with the quiet, cautious question, what if they want what we have? And worse, what if they take it? This thought, simple and chilling, settled deep into the Neolithic psyche. It changed not only architecture but imagination. The world was no longer an open plain of possibility. It was a mosaic of claims, of borders not drawn on maps but etched in custom, ritual and muscle memory. The village became a citadel of belonging, and beyond it stretched uncertainty. Not wilderness exactly, but unclaimed space. And the unclaimed, by definition, was vulnerable, so humans did what they had always done when threatened. They innovated. Stone tools were reimagined. A blade once used to butcher game now found use in combat. Arrowheads became sharper, smaller, more lethal. Spears were no longer only for hunting deer. And with the concentration of people in one place came the rise of strategy, lines of defence, elevated lookouts, early warning systems in the form of dogs, drums and sentinels. Conflict was no longer reactive, it was planned. And with planning, something else began to bloom, the logic of war. It started small, a raid for stored grain, a dispute over land access, a theft of livestock. But over generations, these events left echoes. Memory hardened into grievance. Blood demanded blood. Retaliation became custom. And slowly, ritual violence emerged. Not as an aberration, but as a way of maintaining perceived balance. The idea that war could be organised, even justified, began to take root in the same soil that sprouted wheat. But unlike the crops, this was not seasonal. It was perennial. The archaeological record confirms what the stories suggest. Organised violence did not begin with empires. It began with walls. In sites like Talheim, Germany, mass graves show the signs. Skeletons with crushed skulls, arrow points embedded in vertebrae. These were not one-on-one fights. These were group attacks, coordinated efforts to destroy and displace. The earliest seeds of conquest may not have been about power, but about fear. A fear of hunger, a fear of betrayal, a fear of the outsider. But the outsider was not always distant. Sometimes they lived next door. Because the paradox of early village life is this. The same proximity that enabled cooperation also invited conflict. As houses grew closer, so did expectations. Agreements became necessary about water rights, field boundaries, harvest times, and agreements, when broken or misunderstood, became sources of tension. No longer could you simply walk away. To leave the village was to leave your survival, so instead, people stayed and stewed. The fire that cooked bread also lit tempers. Still, despite all of this, there was no descent into chaos. Early communities were not defined by war, but the possibility of war had entered the cultural atmosphere, and that was enough. Enough to shape decisions, to justify boundaries, to turn watchtowers into permanent fixtures of the skyline. Enough to make peace something that had to be maintained, not assumed. The walls were not always manned, but they were never forgotten. They became part of the background hum of daily life, like the clatter of grinding stones, or the low murmur of voices trading grain for clay pots. They were visible reminders that safety had become something built, not given. And like all human creations, these walls began to shape the minds of those who lived inside them. Children born within stone perimeters would grow up not knowing the world as open and boundless, but as sectioned, guarded, measured. The wall was not just a physical barrier, it was a psychological boundary. With it came a sense of us and them, more rigid than ever before. In the wild world of hunter-gatherers, other humans were often met with caution, but also with curiosity. They were a source of news, tools, genes, and stories. Encounters could be tense, but they were opportunities. Now, in the age of permanent villages and grain economies, contact was more fraught. Strangers were less likely to be passing through and more likely to be encroaching. Not visitors, but invaders. Not messengers, but thieves. The human story pivoted toward suspicion. This suspicion was not always hostile. Often it took the form of ritual. To welcome someone into your settlement required ceremony, sharing food, exchanging gifts, invoking gods or ancestors to bless the meeting. These rituals weren't just hospitality, they were negotiations of trust. Formalities became the mortar that held early alliances together. Without them, every meeting was a gamble. But as some communities grew wealthier, these ceremonies became filters. To host was one thing, to grant access to surplus grain, to water sources, to marriage alliances. That required proof. Proof of status, proof of allegiance, so hierarchy crept in alongside anxiety. The gatekeepers of the village were no longer just warriors. They were priests, elders, lineage heads. The walls protected not just food, but order, a social fabric that now needed guarding as much as the harvest. And from this fabric, new patterns emerged, institutions of control. To enforce boundaries, someone had to define them. To protect property, someone had to record ownership. The rise of walls birthed the rise of roles: watchmen, adjudicators, counters of jars and sacks. Memory was no longer enough. Tally sticks and clay tokens emerged, early accounting tools used to manage inventory and track obligations. With them came an idea even more powerful than property: accountability. Suddenly the fear wasn't just of enemies, it was of imbalance, someone taking too much or contributing too little. And so, the wall was mirrored in custom, invisible lines drawn within the community as well as without. Who could access which granary? Who was responsible for whose debt? The answers were written not on parchment, but in behaviour, expectation, whispered rules passed from elder to child. Thus, walls taught us not only how to exclude, but how to organise, and in doing so, they began to shape the architecture of our societies, not only in clay and stone, but in law, in roles, in memory. Because once the first wall was raised, it never truly came down, not in the mind, not in the customs, not in the thousand small ways that humans began to distinguish between what belonged and what threatened, between the known and the unknowable, between us and them. From Neolithic villages to medieval cities, from Iron Age forts to modern borders, the logic of enclosure has echoed through time like a quiet drumbeat beneath civilization itself. But it began here, with the silent fear of losing what we had. It is a strange and haunting irony. The very abundance that agriculture promised, surplus grain, stable food, permanent shelter, also created the conditions for a new kind of insecurity. To depend on the harvest was to depend on luck, labour, weather, and increasingly on vigilance. Crops could fail, storms could come, but so too could neighbours, and so we stood watch. And perhaps for the first time the human heart grew tired not from running, but from staying. In that stillness, in that rootedness, emerged the burden of permanence. You couldn't simply move to new hunting grounds. You had to negotiate, bargain, defend. The skills that once kept us alive in the wild, adaptability, mobility, improvisation, gave way to new values: predictability, control, order. And around those values, new institutions slowly emerged. Villages became towns, towns became chiefdoms, chiefdoms became states. The wall was not the end of community, but it was the beginning of complexity, because to wall something off is also to define it, to name what lies within, to give shape and meaning to place. And once you do that, you must tend it, with rules, stories, rituals, and yes, with force. Not always brutal, but ever present. The idea that safety requires structure is not wrong, but it is not neutral either. Still, it is too easy to cast this as a fall from grace. The truth is more textured. The Neolithic villagers who built the first walls also built the first shared ovens, the first painted shrines, the first plazas for song and dance. They feared, yes, but they also celebrated. They stored food not only for survival but for feasts. They enclosed their spaces not only out of caution, but out of care. To hold what they loved, to protect what they built, because walls can be prisons, but they can also be hearths. And perhaps that's the paradox at the heart of this chapter in our human journey. We became safer, but not freer, more stable, but less open. The land that once invited us to wander now asked us to stay. And staying required boundaries, staying required structure, and structure inevitably required walls. And still, within those walls we dreamed of harvests, of songs, of gods, of tomorrow. Even as the gates creaked shut, the fire inside was never silent. They did not vanish, they stepped aside. As the tide of agriculture began to ripple across continents, many humans did not follow it. While grain sprouted in furrowed soil and herds were corralled behind woven fences, others watched from the hills, from the forests, from the edges of the growing fields. The story of humanity is often told as a march, from wild to cultivated, from foraging to farming. But the earth holds other stories, quieter ones, half buried in dust and silence. What happens to those who choose not to join the parade? Across the swelling Neolithic plains the foragers remained. They moved through the birch groves of Europe, the pine-shadowed valleys of the Levant, the wind-carved steppes of Central Asia. They still hunted red deer and aurochs, still gathered nuts, roots, and berries, according to old seasonal maps only they could read. And yet, the world around them was changing. The land was being claimed, partitioned, sowed. The air was beginning to carry new scents, of smoke from hearths that never moved, of animals bred not for their strength or agility, but for their obedience. Did the foragers feel nostalgia for the openness? Did they feel pity for those who laboured behind their walls? Or were they themselves the last ones to see clearly, to remember what it meant to be wild and human at once? The archaeological record preserves their footprints in strange places, not in fields, but in the borderlands, in mountain passes where no barley would grow, in marshlands too wet for wheat, in dense forests where the plough could not yet reach. There the foragers lingered, not relics, not backward, but choosing a different rhythm, a rhythm written by rain and migration, not by sun calendars and harvest cycles. But it was not always peace between the two ways of life. Farmers expanded, foragers moved, sometimes they traded, sometimes they fought, sometimes they intermarried. Across what is now Central Europe, the linear pottery culture left behind graves where flint-tipped arrows still rest between ribs, but also woven mats traded between camps, carved figurines showing hybrid gods, half hunter, half harvester. Was it cooperation? Was it conquest? The lines blur in the soil, and yet resistance persisted, not in rebellion, but in remembrance. Even as the great centres of agriculture rose, from the Fertile Crescent to the Yellow River, from Mesoamerica to the Indus Valley, other places told different stories. In what is now Japan, the Jomon people fished, gathered, and made pottery long before they ever touched the plough. In the cold forests of Scandinavia, people hunted elk and gathered shellfish centuries after their neighbours had settled in villages. In Africa's Rift Valley, mobile communities adapted to changing climate by remaining fluid, not fixed. How do you measure a people who leave behind no kingdoms, only campfires? How do you weigh a culture that refuses the ledger, but carries wisdom in footsteps, songs, and skywatching? You look closely, not for monuments, but for patterns, for the quiet persistence of ways that bend without breaking. In these overlooked corners of the world, the so-called others did not disappear. They adapted, they merged, they redefined what it meant to live with the land instead of over it. And sometimes they shaped agriculture in ways that are still misunderstood. Because the origin of farming was not singular. It did not begin only in Mesopotamia or radiate outward in a smooth circle of progress. Instead, it sparked in many places, like stars forming in a clouded sky. Along the Yellow River in China, wild millet was gathered long before it was cultivated. By 7000 BCE, millet fields were being tended in the north, while in the south, rice was beginning its slow domestication in the wetlands. These early East Asian farmers lived not in isolation but in contact with foragers, groups who continued to fish and hunt while also experimenting with planting. In the Americas too, the story is not one of straight lines. In Mesoamerica, squash may have been the first crop domesticated, not corn, as is often believed. Maize itself was born of an astonishing transformation, from the humble grass teosinte, whose tiny, rock-hard kernels bore no resemblance to the golden ears we know today. Over thousands of years, through careful observation and seed selection, indigenous peoples reshaped this grass into a staple crop, and in doing so, reshaped their societies. But many of these societies remained semi-nomadic. They did not immediately build walled villages or adopt intensive agriculture. Instead, they blended cultivation with mobility. Farming and foraging coexisted. Fields were visited, not owned. Crops were encouraged, not commanded. This hybrid mode, often called low-intensity horticulture, challenged the very assumption that agriculture always leads to cities, hierarchies, or conquest. In the highlands of New Guinea, yams and taro were cultivated for thousands of years, but full-scale sedentism came slowly. In the eastern woodlands of North America, sunflower and goosefoot were grown alongside hunting practices that remained essential for survival. Across Southeast Asia, riverine societies built stilt houses and raised pigs while still gathering shellfish and fruits from the surrounding forests. These weren't holdovers, they were choices born of landscape, of climate, of tradition, but also of wisdom. The wisdom that permanence is not always progress, that sometimes the best relationship with nature is one that allows room for movement, for reciprocity, for change. Where humans do not dominate the field but dance with it, planting a little here, returning next season, watching what thrives and what fades. In this, the forgotten others were never lost. They were watching, listening, waiting for the world to remember that growth does not only mean settling down. Sometimes it means staying light enough to walk away. And walking away too became an act of resilience. While the great agricultural centres deepened their roots, clearing forests, redirecting rivers, walling off fields, many communities across the globe chose a different path. They observed the rising demands of sedentary life, the time it took to till soil, the dependence on rainfall, the cycles of pest and blight, and they weighed it against their own lifeways, which required no permission, no fences, no overseers. What they preserved was not just a lifestyle, but a worldview. Among the San peoples of southern Africa, intricate knowledge of animal tracks, water sources, and plant medicines was passed down orally, embedded in stories and dances. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, whose lifeways still echo the Paleolithic, communal sharing and flexible gender roles remain integral. Among the indigenous peoples of the Arctic, hunting and fishing are practiced with an understanding of seasonal flows and ecological balance honed over millennia, a rhythm agriculture could not replace. To call these peoples survivors is both true and misleading. It implies they are remnants, when in fact they are continuations, living traditions that were never erased, only overlooked. They remind us that progress is not always cumulative, that what is old is not always outdated, and that some knowledge can only be kept by walking, listening, adapting in motion. But the tension between farmers and foragers did not vanish. In many places, it intensified. As agriculture spread and population densities increased, land once roamed became land claimed. Hunters were labelled trespassers, pastures turned into boundaries, forests became property. The invisible lines of belonging hardened into exclusion. Yet even amid pressure, foraging cultures adapted. Some learned to move through the seams of agricultural society, becoming traders, guides, and intermediaries. Others became pastoralists, a hybrid life that valued mobility but embraced domesticated animals. These herding societies, from the steppes of Central Asia to the grasslands of Africa, formed their own civilizations, nomadic but complex, untethered but deeply connected. Still, a quiet resistance endured, not through battle but through memory. There were stories that remembered a time before the plough, songs that honoured the deer, not as meat, but as kin, rites that thanked rivers before crossing them. In these the wild remained sacred, not to be subdued, but to be danced with, spoken to, walked alongside. Even today, echoes of that world persist, not only in the remaining hunter-gatherer groups of the Amazon or the Kalahari, but in our habits, the desire to hike, to forage mushrooms, to fish alone at dawn. These urges are not quaint hobbies. They are ancestral ghosts, soft whispers from a time when the human pulse beat in step with the turning of the seasons and the hush of the forest floor. The forgotten others are not truly forgotten. They live on, not only in hidden valleys, but in us, in our fascination with the stars when there's no city light to drown them, in our quiet comfort by a fire, in our longing for forests we've never lived in the strange calm that descends when phones are turned off and feet sink into damp soil. These moments aren't accidents. They are echoes, evolutionary memories from a time when survival required awareness, presence, and kinship with the land. And so, the question rises, did they truly resist civilization, or did they simply remember another kind? For what we call civilization is only one form of complexity. Foraging societies, far from being simplistic, had intricate knowledge systems, flexible social structures, and deeply embedded oral traditions. In many ways, they offered what large-scale agricultural societies struggled to preserve: egalitarianism, leisure, intimate connection to place and community over hierarchy. Take the example of the indigenous groups of the Pacific Northwest. Though some practiced forms of food cultivation, such as the careful tending of camas root fields or oyster beds, They remained non-agricultural by most definitions. Yet they built large, permanent houses, crafted elaborate art, and sustained rich mythological traditions. Civilization here had no plough. Or consider the Aboriginal Australians whose complex fire management practices, often termed fire stick farming, reshaped entire ecosystems to support both biodiversity and human foraging needs. These were not accidental strategies. They were ecological knowledge systems passed down for tens of thousands of years, optimizing the land without owning it. Even the act of not domesticating can be a choice born of wisdom. In the Amazon basin, recent research has shown that what appears to be untouched jungle is often subtly curated. Certain fruit-bearing trees grow in unusually dense patterns around ancient human settlements. It is likely that foragers encourage their spread, not through planting as we understand it, but through selection, movement, and observation. A quiet domestication without domination. This is not to romanticize these lifeways. No society is without hardship or suffering. But it is to recognize that resistance can take many forms. It can be refusal. It can be reinvention. It can be a memory held close across generations, a song sung under moonlight, a tool passed from hand to hand. It can even be strategic adaptation, taking what is useful from agriculture without succumbing to its gravity. In this way, the forgotten others remind us that history is not a line, but a braid. Many strands twisting together, fraying, rejoining. Some rise into empires, others stay close to the earth. Neither is more human. Both carry truths. And when we forget that, when we speak only of the rise of farming as if it were destiny, we lose something. A version of ourselves that still knew how to listen to birdsong and walk without leaving scars. A version of ourselves that once belonged everywhere and nowhere. It is this version, perhaps, that still lives quietly inside each of us. The part that feels uneasy in concrete corridors, that sighs when caught beneath fluorescent light too long. The part that slows when walking through tall grass, or pauses at the sudden flight of birds from a hedgerow. These aren't just poetic reflexes, they are echoes of a shared past, a neural inheritance from ancestors who knew no fences, who read landscapes like scripture. And while the sweep of agricultural civilization has reshaped the world in iron, wheat, and stone, the forager spirit has not died. It flows beneath the surface, sometimes literal, in the lifeways of indigenous peoples still fighting for land, for rights, for recognition. Sometimes metaphorical, in the countercultures and communities that reject permanence, resist possession, and choose connection over control. We see it in seasonal nomads who herd reindeer across Arctic tundra, in jungle tribes mapping forests without maps, in seed savers, soil walkers, and those who live not off the grid, but in deeper rhythm with it. In a world pushed toward uniformity, these living echoes are not relics. They are resistance, not against modernity, but against amnesia. Because to forget the foragers is to forget who we were for 95% of our time on Earth. We walked gently for hundreds of thousands of years. We shared more than we stored. We adapted to the land rather than reshaping it. These were not primitive choices. They were refined, intentional, wise. And while agriculture brought abundance, it also brought burdens. Hierarchy, disease, conflict over land, environmental exhaustion. The old way, though not perfect, offered a different calibration, one not of domination, but of dance. And so, the myth of the inevitable farmer begins to crack. History is not a story of one success. It is a tapestry of experiments, many still unfinished. The spread of agriculture did not erase foraging lifeways. It coexisted with them, competed, merged, evolved. Even today, the line is not clear. Gardens and greenhouses, urban foragers collecting herbs between pavement cracks, farmers' markets reviving ancestral seeds, the resurgence of indigenous land practices. All of these, in small, meaningful ways, carry forward the knowledge that once shaped entire continents without building a single wall. What the forgotten others truly offer is not nostalgia, but perspective, a reminder that growth is not the only goal, that living well is not the same as living large, that being rooted does not always mean standing still. In a time when global systems strain under the weight of overproduction, climate collapse, and disconnection from land, their story whispers an alternative, slower, smaller, wilder. And maybe that's what we need. not to return to the past, but to remember it, to carry forward its wisdom like a flint in the pocket, not always visible, but ready when the fire must be lit again, not lost, only waiting. Some transformations are loud. They rise like thunder, shake the ground, demand attention. But others unfold in silence, weaving themselves into the marrow of our bones, the folds of our brains, the pigments of our skin. The agricultural revolution did not merely alter how humans lived, it altered who humans were. And long after the fields were ploughed and the villages built, long after the myths were whispered and the gods named, the changes continued, subtle, invisible, but irrevocable. What does it mean for a species to change itself? The answer lies not only in cities or tools, but in blood and milk and language. In the millennia that followed the spread of farming, the human body began to reflect its new entanglement with soil and seed. Where once we were nourished by diverse seasonal diets of wild plants and hunted meat, the shift to monoculture carved a new nutritional landscape, dominated by grains and shaped by scarcity masked as abundance. The body adapted, but not evenly and not easily. In northern Europe, a mutation emerged, small at first, perhaps even inconsequential. It allowed adults to digest lactose, the sugar in milk, long after infancy. In a world where cattle were now constant companions, where dairy could mean survival in the lean seasons, this mutation spread rapidly. Today, in some regions, nearly all people carry it. But across most of the globe, Africa, East Asia, indigenous America, it remains rare. Agriculture, once again, drew lines across the species, carving out distinctions not just of culture, but of biology. Skin, too, bore the legacy of cultivation. As human communities settled in northern latitudes, often under clouded skies, surrounded by snow-reflected gloom, the ancestral melanin shield, so vital under the blazing equatorial sun, became a barrier to vitamin D. The body, ever adaptive, shifted. Over generations, skin lightened. Not as a sign of superiority, but as a survival strategy, to allow in the light now filtered by latitude. These changes did not define races. They traced weather. They mapped agriculture's new boundaries. Even the gut, that ancient bacterial archive, began to change its script. The human microbiome, once diverse and complex, narrowed under the relentless sameness of cereal-based diets. In hunter-gatherers today, like the Hadza of Tanzania, the gut still tells the old story. Wild tubers, raw honey, fibrous roots. But in most modern humans, the bacterial orchestra plays a different tune, one shaped by wheat, rice, barley, and corn. How many emotions, how many thoughts are nudged at the margins by these microbial cohabitants? How much of who we are is shaped by what we now digest, and what we have forgotten how to? But as the body changed, so too did the mind. The myths we told began to shift. Stories once rooted in movement and moonlight began to circle, grain and ground. Gods of the hunt gave way to gods of the harvest. And from these new myths, new structures of meaning arose. Agriculture did not simply feed bodies, it fed imaginations. As cycles of planting and harvest dictated the rhythm of life, humanity began to think in seasons, in returns, in permanence. Stories changed shape. They no longer wandered like the hunters who told them. They rooted themselves, circling back on themselves like furrows carved across a field. The first symbolic systems linked humans not to stars and animals alone, but to soil. Across Mesopotamia, early figurines emphasized hips and bellies, metaphors for fertility tied to the abundance of grain. In Egypt, the Nile's annual flood became a cosmic event, mythologized as the tears of Isis or the breath of gods. Ritual calendars emerged, turning time into something sculpted, predictable, sacred. As humans built temples of mud brick and limestone, they built conceptual temples too, hierarchies, moral codes, cosmologies grounded in agricultural cycles. This shift in symbolism marked a transformation deeper than architecture. Farming required planning, a mind oriented toward the future, toward coordination, toward control. To plant a seed was to make a promise to the self months ahead, and in honouring that promise, communities reshaped their collective identities. They became the people of this valley, the children of that river, the keepers of these fields. Sedentary life turned geography into identity. Land was no longer just space, it became story. And as stories grew, so did memory. Oral tradition had always been humanity's archive, but agriculture demanded even more precision. Surpluses had to be tracked, debts remembered, claims recorded, weather patterns noted. Counting systems emerged from necessity. Tokens, tallies, knots in string. All early attempts to hold information steady as societies expanded beyond what memory alone could contain. Then, somewhere between necessity and inspiration, writing was born. Not first as literature or poetry, but as accounting. The earliest clay tablets from Sumer record grain rations, livestock transactions, temple inventories. Lines pressed into wet clay by reed styluses were not meant to move the heart, they were meant to stabilize society. But once the door opened, it did not close. Writing evolved from marks of commerce into vessels of myth, law, philosophy, longing. The seed that sprouted in the field sprouted again in the mind. But each new tool, milk, grain, walls, writing, carried a cost. Just as lactose persistence brought new possibilities alongside new dependencies, writing preserved memory but also fixed it, reducing fluid oral stories into rigid text. Identities that once shifted with migration grew anchored, sometimes calcified. Myths codified into doctrine, values hardened into law. Culture, like the crops, could now be cultivated, or controlled. And yet these transformations were not imposed from above. They emerged from countless small choices, gestures repeated across generations. A woman grinding grain at dawn, a child learning to read marks on clay, a shepherd carrying milk to a communal hearth. Tiny acts stitching together the grand tapestry of agricultural civilization. The body changed, the symbols changed, the stories changed, and through them, humanity changed with a quiet, accumulative force, subtle as dust drifting over a newly ploughed field. But dust carries memory. It carries pollen, spores, fragments of plants crushed beneath sandals and stones. In the sediment of time, we find not only seeds, but symbols, and in those symbols, etched in bone, painted on pottery, pressed into clay, we glimpse how farming civilizations rewrote their place in the world. The turning of soil was also the turning of myth. Grain was not merely sustenance, it became sacred. Across early agrarian cultures, myths of fertility and rebirth proliferated. From Sumer to the Nile to the Indus, the agricultural cycle was reflected in divine archetypes. Dying and resurrecting gods, seasonal descent and return, life birthed from death. Osiris of Egypt, cut down and reborn like the barley he embodied. Tammuz of Mesopotamia, mourned in ritual as the dry season arrived. Demeter and Persephone in Greece, mother and daughter entangled in cycles of loss and bloom. These myths weren't abstract. They were maps, emotional and symbolic blueprints for how to live in a world now structured by the rhythms of harvest. And as harvests grew, so did hierarchies. Farming required coordination, but coordination breeds power. The headman who once negotiated between clans now managed surplus. Temples became granaries. Priests became accountants of the divine. With writing in hand, they recorded not just crops, but genealogies, laws, victories. The symbolic system had become a system of control, and with it, the stories themselves began to stratify. Stories once shared around fires became guarded in sanctuaries. Yet alongside these shifts, another transformation took root. Not of gods or laws, but of how humans saw themselves in relation to the earth. As land became property and surplus became wealth, the earth was no longer kin. It was resource. Its cycles were still honoured, but increasingly in service to human need. This was perhaps the most profound change of all. From belonging to the world to expecting the world to belong to us. And it was here, in this liminal space between reverence and dominion, that culture began to crystallize. Not as shared fluidity, but as fixed identity. Farming didn't just grow food, it grew us and them. It drew lines between those who cultivated and those who did not, between centre and periphery, between sacred land and wilderness. But even as the plough carved deep furrows into the earth, language ploughed even deeper into the mind. It was language, extended, formalized and preserved through writing, that enabled ideology to anchor. Myths became scripture. Memory became record. The past could now be referenced, enforced, claimed. Identity could be traced, not just through stories whispered at dusk, but through lineage listed on tablets, through boundaries carved in stone. And slowly the future was no longer something wandered into. It was something planned, shaped, and remembered in advance. A future rooted in the logic of the seed, a logic of anticipation, of measured time and calculated yield, of sowing not just crops but systems, and watching them grow according to design. This orientation to time, so different from the circular rhythms of foraging life, began to reshape everything from architecture to identity. Villages became grids, calendars became mandates. The stories told in these settled worlds no longer meandered with the pace of a migrating herd, but marched forward with the ticking of grain counts and seasons. And yet, even in this new order, memory remained sacred. In some cultures, oral tradition continued to hold enormous power. Elders, priests, poets, these were the bearers of lineages, of land claims, of cosmologies that made sense of suffering and celebration alike. But over time, those oral rivers began to dry into written channels, and with writing came permanence, not just of language, but of law. It was a double-edged harvest. What could be recorded could also be judged. What could be remembered could also be revised. Writing became the seed of history, and history, the architecture of power. The stories etched into stone or scratched onto clay became foundations of empires. They justified rule, claimed descent from gods, outlined who belonged and who did not. For the first time, memory could be owned, and with ownership came erasure. Alternative myths, those of the forest dweller, the wanderer, the herder, were buried beneath the plough of civilization's narrative. But not all writing was grand. In early farming communities, simple marks recorded modest lives, debts repaid, marriages promised, grain measured, sheep tallied. These were not the annals of kings, but the breath of daily life, and from these humble notations, something unexpected emerged. The idea that even ordinary existence was worthy of being remembered. To write was to believe that what happens matters, and as symbolic systems matured, they began to reflect not just events, but values. The flood story of Gilgamesh, the legal codes of Hammurabi, the hymns of the Rig Veda. These texts were more than records. They were reflections of what agricultural civilizations feared, hoped, and believed. They encoded the sacred geometry of ploughed fields into the structures of society itself. But not all changes were written in ink or clay. Some were written in flesh. The genetic adaptations that emerged alongside farming did not stop with lactose tolerance or skin pigmentation. They extended to immunity, metabolism, even stature. As diets narrowed, so did nutritional diversity. Some populations grew shorter, more susceptible to disease, more dependent on specific foods. The body had been reshaped by its relationship to the field. And though culture seemed to elevate humanity, biology whispered a subtler truth. We were still changing, still evolving, still being cultivated. In many ways, the seed had become the sculptor, and we, shaped by its demands, told stories to make sense of the sculpture. Stories of gods and kings, of origin and order, of soil and sacrifice. Stories that, even now, live beneath our languages, coded into the metaphors we reach for without realizing why. We speak of ideas taking root, of planting hope, of sowing doubt. We refer to cultivating talent, to fields of knowledge, to harvesting rewards. These phrases are more than poetic residue. They are linguistic fossils, preserving the worldview of a species forever reshaped by agriculture. In this way, the agricultural revolution is not simply something that happened long ago. It continues, subtly, in every gesture of thought, every turn of phrase, every map we draw in our minds. Even today, our identities remain tethered to the transformations begun in that slow turning of soil. Genetic memory is not conscious, but it is real. Our cravings, our rhythms, our microbial symbionts, they all speak of lives once lived in fields and granaries, among animals and myths. Some of us can trace our lineages back through farming lineages uninterrupted. Others descend from people who resisted or adapted more recently, whose stories survived not in script, but in song and shadow. And all of us, in one way or another, are descendants of that great convergence of skin, seed, and story. It was not a revolution of swords or shouts, but of habits repeated. Hands sowing grain each spring, mouths telling the same tales beside cooking fires, bones bending toward the yoke of new labour, new logic. Over time, what began as convenience became necessity. What began as experiment became inheritance. What began as adaptation became identity. This is the quiet power of cultural evolution. To carry changes so deep, we no longer see them as changes at all. We wear them like skin. We speak them like breath. We feel them like instinct. And yet this awareness, that we have been shaped by something as mundane and as monumental as farming, offers more than historical insight. It offers humility. For if we were reshaped once, we can be reshaped again. Not by returning to a past that never was, but by remembering that every structure, every system, every story is built and can be rebuilt. The agricultural revolution was not a single event, but a cascading sequence of discoveries and losses, of gains and griefs, of astonishing creativity and unintended consequences. In its wake, humanity emerged as something new, a species no longer only walking with the wild, but sculpting the world with symbols, laws, and ploughs. And even as cities rose and gods were carved, the old rhythms did not vanish. They echoed beneath stone and syllable, the ancestral memory of the forest, the fire, the open sky. In this, we are not simply the children of farmers, we are the children of transition. We carry the seeds of many worlds within us, and whether we speak in clay or code, in harvest song or written word, we are still telling the story of how the land shaped us, and how, in shaping it, we became who we are. We are modern now, swaddled in fibre optics, vaccinated, carbon-fed, and globally entangled, yet somewhere within us something stirs when we touch wild earth with bare hands. In our cities of cement and circuitry, we feel a hunger that food cannot satisfy, a hunger that is not for more, but for before, as if, behind the veils of progress we have always suspected, something was left behind in the fields we abandoned, in the forests we cleared, in the stories we stopped telling. What happens when the wild calls us back, not as conquerors, but as children seeking something we've forgotten? For the past few centuries we have spoken of agriculture as destiny, rows of grain marching across continents, meat machines, vertical farms, the triumph of yield over uncertainty. But yield is not nourishment. Production is not harmony. The industrial agriculture that now feeds billions also separates us from soil, from season, from the sacred pace of life. It replaces cycles with supply chains, ecosystems with economies of scale, and in doing so, it leaves us in paradox, full but malnourished, connected but rootless, efficient but eroded. So we begin to look backwards, or perhaps sideways. What if the answer is not in abandoning modernity, but in remembering our pre-modern intelligence? In the forests of Germany, rewilding efforts reintroduce lynx and bison, not to decorate the land, but to heal it. In the dry valleys of Kenya, farmers readopt traditional zai pits to trap water and restore fertility. In the Andes, Incan terraces are reborn, holding back erosion with the grace of ancestral stone. This is not nostalgia, it is repair. We call it permaculture, agroforestry, regenerative agriculture. These are modern names for ancient patterns, ways of thinking that do not dominate nature but dance with it. They ask not what we can take from the land, but how we can live in relationship with it. The Masanobu Fukuokas of the world do not invent such ideas. They remember them, observing the field, waiting before acting, trusting the intelligence of ecosystems to balance themselves when humans step aside just enough. But it is not only the soil that is seeking equilibrium, it is our own bodies. The ancestral diet movement, often clouded by commercial noise, is in its deepest form a quiet longing for metabolic memory, to chew as we once chewed, to digest as our ancestors did, with the biome of a gatherer still, echoing through our guts. The return to fermented foods, bitter greens, bone broths. These are not trends. They are symptoms of an ancient body trying to remember a home it no longer walks in. And the question rises again, are we, in this century, finally beginning to sense what was lost when the hunt ended, when the seed was sown, when the wild was fenced? Or are we merely circling the same wound, dressing it now with the language of progress, yet still unsure of the cure? What does it mean to feed not just the body, but the spirit of a species that evolved to wander? To wander was never merely to move, it was to listen, to walk through the world with eyes attuned to subtle changes, a shift in wind, the smell of rain, the flick of an animal's ear beyond the trees. It was a dialogue with the land carried out in silence. Modern life, with its mapped grids and scheduled lives, rarely allows such listening. But in the quiet fringes of culture, in community gardens, in wilderness retreats, in the slow work of hand-tilled earth, that listening is returning. There is a critique now, whispered at first, then louder, of the machine that replaced the meadow. The modern agricultural system designed for abundance has delivered not just food but fragility. Monocultures stretch for miles, vulnerable to blight and drought. Pesticides bleed into water tables. Topsoil, once rich and alive, erodes with each harvest. The system works, but only just, and only with massive inputs, subsidies, and the relentless burning of ancient sunlight in the form of fossil fuels. And beneath this system, a deeper discomfort simmers. Many are beginning to see that the very logic of industrial farming, maximising output, minimising cost, mirrors the logic of colonialism and extraction. Land becomes object, labour becomes number, life becomes yield, and just as the plough once broke the forest to make way for fields, so too does the algorithm break tradition to make way for profit. In response, new movements rise, or perhaps old ones reawaken. The idea of food sovereignty, born from indigenous and smallholder communities, insists on more than food access. It demands respect for local knowledge, for ancestral seeds, for the right to grow what nourishes not just the belly, but the culture. In this vision, the farm is not a factory. It is a story, passed down through generations, told through the language of compost and care. Some are turning toward wildcrafting, the ethical gathering of wild plants, as a practice of humility and observation. Others embrace forest gardening, where humans collaborate with ecosystems to co-create edible landscapes that mimic nature's own architecture. In cities, rooftop greenhouses and vertical gardens reintroduce green to grey, offering not just tomatoes but moments of wonder, and all of it points towards something deeper, a hunger not for the wild as spectacle, but the wild as teacher. The wild does not rush, it does not overproduce, it does not discard what it no longer wants, it regenerates, patiently, in cycles so long they escape our market minds. And when humans return to the rhythms of wildness, even in small ways, they often find themselves not diminished but expanded, slower, quieter, more rooted. In this, the return of the wild is not a rejection of civilization, but a recalibration of what it means to be civilized. Perhaps we are not seeking to abandon the harvest, only to remember the forest it came from, because even as we cultivate, we are still, in some part of us, foragers, still drawn to the unpredictable richness of a wild grove, to the thrill of finding something not planted but discovered. This impulse lives on in weekend mushroom hunters, in foraging workshops held in suburban parks, in the quiet joy of picking a berry from a bush no one owns. There is a reverence in these acts, small as they may seem, a recognition that life does not always need to be engineered to be abundant. This is more than romanticism. It is an ecological instinct. Science now confirms what ancestral traditions long understood. Diversity sustains resilience. In soil, in diet, in culture. Industrial agriculture, with its uniform rows and chemical dependencies, often strips away this resilience in the name of control. But nature thrives in difference, in the interplay of species, in the messy middle ground where no one element dominates. So too, perhaps, should we. And in that spirit, we see the rise of rewilding, not just of landscapes, but of inner life. To rewild is not merely to let wolves run again in Yellowstone or to watch the beaver reclaim its dam. It is also to untame the mind, to resist the pull toward hyper-efficiency, endless productivity, and the illusion that mastery is the same as harmony. Rewilding says, let things grow as they wish, not just as we command. It is an invitation to step out of the managerial mindset and into a more reciprocal one, to walk not as overseer, but as participant, and it has implications beyond agriculture. touching how we educate, how we parent, how we relate to our own minds and bodies. We begin to ask, what if healing is not about optimizing, but about listening? What if the wild has something to teach us not just about ecosystems, but about being? Even our relationship to time is shifting. The industrial age taught us to think in minutes, quarters, fiscal years, but the ecological world moves in generations, in seasons, in slow returns. Permaculture teaches us to plant trees whose fruit we may never taste. Indigenous land stewardship teaches patience, fire cycles of 30 years, seed saving over centuries. In this worldview, success is not rapid yield, but sustained presence. The measure of good practice is not profit, but whether the grandchildren will thank us for it. This too is a form of time travel, to inhabit an older rhythm, and through it we see that the return of the wild was never about reversing the clock. It was about deepening our presence in this moment, learning again how to be in place, not just physically, but spiritually, not just sustainably, but lovingly, to touch the land not with dominion, but with devotion. That word, devotion, reminds us that the return of the wild is not just ecological or nutritional, but emotional, spiritual. At its core, it is about relationship, with place, with memory, with a version of the human story that did not see nature as other, but as kin. This is why many of the movements now gathering energy, from indigenous-led conservation efforts to ancestral diet revivals to climate-conscious spiritualities, speak not just in scientific terms, but in the language of reverence. In this light, rewilding is not the opposite of progress. It is a rerouting of progress in something older, wiser, and more balanced. Take, for example, the astonishing resurgence of ancient grains like einkorn, emmer, and teff, seeds once thought obsolete, now prized for their resilience, nutrition, and deep cultural ties. These crops don't just survive harsher climates, they tell stories. They carry the fingerprints of forgotten ancestors, the knowledge of dry seasons endured, of celebrations baked into bread. Or consider the way language itself begins to change when people return to the land. Words long considered archaic re-enter our vocabularies: coppice, glade, gleaning, hearth. Place names regain their meaning. Local dialects preserve the landscape in syllables. Hills named after winds, rivers for their bends. Even our sense of self softens, becoming less about personal achievement and more about belonging to something vast, seasonal, shared. In the slow food movement, meals become rituals again. Not performances, not transactions, but ceremonies of patience and presence. Ingredients are valued not for their novelty, but for their story. Where they came from, who grew them, how long they took to ripen. This isn't about elitism or aestheticism, it's about meaning. And meaning, once woven into the way we eat, begins to touch how we think. There is a word in Japanese, shinrin-yoku, forest bathing. It captures the quiet healing of simply being among trees, without agenda. In Finland, the concept of sisu speaks to a deep resilience drawn from nature, from enduring harsh seasons with grace. Across cultures, across continents, there are whispers of the same idea, that the wild is not chaos, but a kind of ancient intelligence, and that when we tune to its rhythm, we find not regression, but regeneration. This reconnection is not always easy. It asks us to slow down, to unlearn, to let go of the illusion that we are separate. It may feel awkward, even painful, like stepping barefoot after years in shoes. But over time, the sensitivity returns. The foot learns the path again, and so does the soul. Because when we engage with the wild, whether through farming that listens, food that remembers, or stories that honour the land, we do not return to the past. We return to a part of ourselves that was never fully lost, only quieted, waiting for the silence to end. And now the silence does begin to break, not with a roar, but a rustle, a growing murmur of footsteps on forest trails, of shovels turning compost, of seeds dropped gently into restored earth. Across the world, individuals and communities are awakening to the realization that reconnection is not a luxury, nor a trend, but a need, physiological, emotional, and ancestral. The rise of ancestral health movements speaks to this need in a visceral way. Practitioners of rewilded fitness run barefoot, climb trees, lift logs, mimicking the functional strength and variability of prehistoric life. Those who adopt ancestral diets seek not weight loss fads, but microbial reunion, with fermented foods, seasonal shifts, bitter greens that challenge and tone the palate, and fasting rhythms that speak the old language of feast and lean. What they all share is not a wish to escape the present, but to restore a continuity between the ancient and the modern body. Because the body remembers. Our enzymes still recognize raw honey. Our knees are still shaped for squatting. Our circadian rhythms still respond to the sun and stars. Even in concrete apartments, our genes listen for birdsong, for flowing water, for wind in the grass. The wild, it turns out, has never left us. We carry it in blood, in breath, in instinct. This understanding extends outward, to how we raise children, to how we grieve, to how we mark time. Birth and death, once intimate and embodied events, are being slowly reclaimed from sterile abstraction. Home births, natural burials, communal ceremonies that honour the seasons, these too are part of the wild's return. They remind us that life is not a linear line of progress, but a circle of transformation. And in that circle, the future begins to shimmer, not as a utopia, but as a homecoming. A future where technology doesn't dominate nature, but serves to illuminate it. Where cities hum with green rooftops, food forests, and community farms. Where ecological literacy is taught alongside math and poetry, and children grow up knowing the names of the plants that feed them, and the plants that don't. This is not fantasy. It is already happening, in pockets, in pilot programs, in practices whispered between generations and shouted from grassroots movements. What was once alternative is becoming ancestral again, not because we are going back, but because we are going deeper. And so, the story of agriculture, which began with the last great hunt and the first scattered seeds, now enters a new chapter. A chapter where we ask not only how we grow our food, but how we grow our sense of belonging. A chapter where the field and the forest are not in conflict, but in conversation. The return of the wild is not a regression. It is an invitation to remember that we are not above the earth, but of it. To live, not as owners of the land, but as its kin, as once we did, as perhaps we can again. We do not live at the end of history. We live inside its breath, exhaled from a past that never fully leaves us, inhaled toward futures we are still learning how to name. 12,000 years ago, humanity planted more than seeds. We planted a new way of being. And now we walk with its harvest, our landscapes, our languages, our longings. This chapter, this closing movement, is not about return or rejection, but remembrance. What did we lose when we began to grow our own food? What did we find? What remains, glowing and unresolved, in the story of the human animal and the land that raised it? Once adaptation was movement. Climate shifted, and we followed the herds. Rivers dried, and we found another valley. Our resilience was mobility, flexibility, reciprocity. But agriculture rewrote the meaning of change. Now we adapted not by moving with the world, but by reshaping it to stand still. Domestication was a double mirror. The barley changed us as we changed the barley. The sheep softened in the hand even as the hand grew more calloused from the shears. In this slow duet of biology and culture, something deeply human emerged, a creature shaped not only by what it hunted, but by what it chose to let grow. Choice. That is the real hinge in this long arc. Because agriculture was never inevitable. It arose haltingly in scattered pockets. The Fertile Crescent, the Yangtze River Basin, Mesoamerica, the Sahel. Parallel sparks, not a single fire. Even as farming expanded, it coexisted for millennia with foraging, pastoralism and hybrid systems that blurred the line between wild and cultivated. It is easy, in hindsight, to draw a clean line from sickle to satellite, from millet to megacity. But what if history is not a straight path, but a garden of forks? And in those forks, in those branching choices, and we see the fingerprints of culture, of spirit, of survival under pressure. Some groups turned grain into power, organising labour into pyramids and temples. Others sowed kinship and myth among forest clearings, balancing harvest with ritual. And still others resisted the plough entirely, their ways less visible in the archaeological record, but no less real. Even now, many indigenous traditions remind us that agriculture was not a conquest of nature, but a conversation with it, a seasonal exchange written in ash, water, and time. So when we say that agriculture was both loss and liberation, we are not speaking in contradiction, but in truth. Loss of dietary diversity, of bodily resilience, of ecological intimacy. Liberation from the knife edge of starvation, from dependence on migratory chance, from the silence of an empty granary. We must hold both, not as competing narratives, but as harmonies in the same song. A song that has been playing for 12,000 years, sometimes in the key of progress, sometimes in the minor chords of unintended cost. But what is the refrain of this song? What idea carries across the millennia, still audible in our minds and bones even now? What does it mean to grow and to be grown by the land? Perhaps it means that every human life is a negotiation between inheritance and intention. We inherit bodies shaped by ancient diets, ancient labours, ancient climates. We inherit cultures built on stories of sowing and reaping, of sacrifice and renewal, of order wrested from the earth. And yet, within that inheritance, intention blooms. The choices we make, as individuals, as communities, as civilizations, continue the long arc of adaptation that began with the first hesitant seeds pressed into soil. This arc is not smooth. It bends, twists, doubles back. It is shaped by droughts and ice ages, by migrations and memories, by brilliance and error. Agriculture was one such bend, a profound pivot in how we understood the world. It tethered us, for the first time, to the future. To plant a seed is to declare belief in tomorrow. To harvest is to confirm that belief was not misplaced. And so, generation after generation, we built our calendars, our ceremonies, our ethics around this fragile promise, that the earth will respond to our labour with life, but promises always come with cost. When we anchored ourselves to fields, we anchored ourselves to responsibility. To protect those fields, we built walls. To coordinate labour, we built hierarchies. To distribute surplus, we created systems, some equitable, some cruel. The first farmer was not only the first cultivator, but the first accountant, the first planner, the first warrior. For the world of agriculture is a world of risk, a late frost, a swarm of locusts, a sick ox, a rival village. Each could unravel months of human hope, and yet from this risk came innovation, irrigation, storage, trade networks, mathematics, writing. In a strange and ironic symmetry, the uncertainty of the harvest forged the tools of civilization. Wheat in its vulnerability made us ingenious. Barley made us collaborative. Rice made us patient. Maize made us adaptive. Each crop sculpted not only our diets, but our minds. It is tempting to see agriculture as destiny, as the moment humanity grew up. But such a story is too simple. For every valley that embraced the plough, another resisted it. For every village that built walls, another wandered freely. For every mouth fed by granaries, another was nourished by forest, river, or tundra. Humans have never been a single story. And agriculture is not the only mirror in which our reflection appears. Still, the seed carries wisdom. It teaches that growth is not linear, that life cycles through death and renewal, that nourishment comes from reciprocity. What we tend tends us in return. These lessons shaped early farmers as deeply as they shape permaculturists and ecologists today. To plant, in any age, is an act of humility. It reminds us that we live in a relationship, not a conquest, with the world. And perhaps that is the heart of this final chapter. We did not only change the earth also changed us. Its seasons carved rituals into our calendars. Its cycles taught us patience and anticipation. Its unpredictability fostered both fear and faith. To farm is to live in a paradox, at once in control and at the mercy of forces larger than ourselves. This tension birthed not just societies but stories. Stories of gods and rains, of floods and famines, of sacred groves and cursed lands. Our myths, like our crops, grew in rows and rows, cultivated to make meaning out of the soil's silence. As our bodies changed to accommodate the harvest, through genetic tweaks like lactase persistence or denser bones shaped by sedentary work, our minds changed too. We began to think in units of time and yield. We developed memory palaces made of granaries and calendars that followed the moon and seed. These were not just practical tools, they were reflections of a deepening relationship with continuity, a longing for permanence in a world that had once offered only impermanence. And with continuity came history. To be human, after agriculture, was to live within stories that stretched beyond a single lifetime. Oral traditions lengthened, genealogies rooted families to land, seasonal ceremonies etched cultural memory into shared experience. Eventually, the need to remember, to tally debts, record seasons, honour ancestors, led to marks on clay, to tokens and scripts. Writing did not simply arise for poetry or philosophy. It sprouted first from the seed count, the grain list, the ledger. So in this closing movement, let us not think of farming as a break from humanity's essence, but rather as an expansion of it. Agriculture extended the human horizon. It gave us cause to look ahead, to invest in generations yet unborn, to find identity not just in kinship but in place. It was not a fall from grace, nor a final ascent, but a shift, a long slow tuning of human possibility. And now, in the modern world, we carry these ancient seeds still. We carry them in our languages. Words like culture and cultivate share a root for a reason. We carry them in our rituals, from the breaking of bread to the lighting of harvest fires. We carry them in our imaginations, in stories of paradise lost and abundance regained. These are not just echoes, they are inheritances. To understand them is not to judge the past, but to inhabit it fully, and to carry it forward with awareness. The truth is, we are still choosing, every day, in every field, garden, store aisle, and city square. We choose what to grow, what to consume, what to protect, what to restore. And in these choices the arc bends again, toward something still forming, still unfolding. We carry seeds, but we also carry the power to decide where and how they will be planted next. That power, subtle, often unnoticed, may be the most human thing about us. For all the tools we've shaped, all the soil we've turned, all the systems we've built, what endures is not just what we have made, but the way we imagine what might come next. Agriculture, at its heart, is imagination. To see a future in a seed, to see bread in a field of waving grass. The past 12,000 years were not merely survival, they were a grand unfolding of human vision. And yet no vision is without consequence. The same ingenuity that built irrigation channels also created empires. The same foresight that led to storage also led to stockpiling, to hoarding, to scarcity amid abundance. We organised our world so thoroughly around the needs of grain and livestock that we began to confuse those needs with our own. And as we settled into this new rhythm, other ways of life, other cadences, other relationships to land and time, faded or were pushed aside. But they were never extinguished. In every era, voices remained. Whispers in the mountains, dances in the plains, teachings passed from hand to hand, from those who remembered how to live with the land, not just off of it. And today, those whispers are rising again. In the face of ecological crisis, in the fatigue of industrial life, many are turning, not backward but inward, to ask a question as old as any plough. What kind of relationship do we want with the earth? This question, though framed anew, echoes deeply with our ancestors' choices. They too lived in changing climates. They too faced unknowns. But instead of despair, they turned to collaboration, with soil, with season, with each other. That legacy still hums beneath our cities, in the cracks of pavement where dandelions bloom, in the community gardens between apartment blocks, in the ceremonies that honour solstice and harvest. To carry seeds, then, is not just to carry history. It is to carry hope. It is to remember that life, for all its fragility, persists through care, through attention, through the quiet but persistent belief that tomorrow is worth preparing for. And in this belief, we find again the thread that ties us to those early farmers, and beyond them, to the foragers who knew which roots to dig, which berries to spare, which stories to pass around the firelight. We are not merely descendants of the agricultural revolution. We are its interpreters, its heirs, its editors. Each generation rewrites the contract between humanity and the land. Some lines bring harm, others bring healing. The choice is not behind us. It is here, now. In every seed we save, every field we regenerate, every culture we nourish, And in that quiet act of tending, of choosing care over conquest, we may finally begin to understand the journey we've taken. It was never a straight path. There was no master plan. The first grains that fell near the edges of ancient hearths did not arrive with blueprints. There were no declarations or revolutions, no rulers or borders, only habit, observation, and time. Over countless generations, one quiet choice at a time, we reshaped the very pattern of human life. This reshaping wasn't uniform. It didn't spread evenly or predictably. It pulsed in waves, stalled in dry seasons, surged in fertile valleys, and faltered on rocky highlands. But slowly, irrevocably, the story of grain and herd became the story of us. Our bones tell it. Our myths whisper it. Our languages still carry its roots. And yet, beneath all of it, something older persists. The forager's eye, the sense of enough, the relationship not of dominance but of reciprocity. These older truths never left us. They simply wove themselves into the rhythms of field and fence, of seed and storehouse. We forgot them at times. We silenced them, other times. But they are not lost. Today, even amid towering cities and digitized fields, the ancient questions remain. How shall we live? What is enough? What is worthy of being passed on? Because we are still choosing, still planting, still carrying forward the burdens and blessings of this long experiment in cultivation. Not just with our hands, but with our systems, our ethics, our economies, our education. The seeds we carry now are not only for sustenance, they are for shaping the human future. And that future, like the past, will not be built in certainty. It will be built in relationship, a relationship with land that is not measured only in yield but in health, a relationship with time that is not only progress but presence, a relationship with each other that values care over conquest and kinship over control. Because agriculture was never just about food, it was about transformation. It changed what we eat, yes, but more than that, it changed how we think, how we live, how we imagine. And in that imagining, we glimpsed something greater than survival. We glimpsed meaning, legacy, the long arc of belonging. So perhaps that is what we carry now, not just the tools of a cultivated world, but the awareness that it is still being cultivated, that we are still gardeners of what comes next. The soil is never blank. The future is never empty. We are always planting, and what we plant, with intention or by accident, will one day be inherited by those who come after, wondering what kind of ancestors we tried to be. Thank you, fellow Sapien, for walking this long path through our human transformation, from foragers to farmers, from wanderers to sowers of seed. For being here as we trace that journey together, I'm deeply grateful. If this story helped you feel a deeper connection to time, or sparked a question about what we left behind, or simply gave you a moment of quiet reflection, thank you for sharing that space with me. I wonder what part of this story will remain with you. A word, an image, a feeling beneath language. Whether it was the idea of wheat gently bending us to its will, or the aching beauty of bones speaking across millennia, or the silent realization that we are still choosing what kind of future to grow, these are the fragments that weave us together. If you feel called to share your reflection, let it be a quiet offering in the comments, a small thread in the larger tapestry of this shared exploration. If you'd like to keep unraveling the past with me through stories of stone, silence, and time, feel free to like, subscribe, or simply come back for the next walk. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay thoughtful,